My name is Savannah, and at 33 years old, I learned that the people you build an empire for are usually the first ones to lock you out of the castle. Right after a grueling divorce hearing, my mother-in-law blocked the front door of my own home, screaming at me to get out and never return. I simply smiled because she had no idea that I had already bought the debt on the property right out from under them, and I had just fired her precious son from his own company. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The drive back from the downtown Chicago courthouse felt like moving through a thick fog. Rain had been falling all morning, leaving the suburban streets slick and gray. I gripped the steering wheel of my modest sedan, the rhythmic sound of the windshield wipers providing the only comfort in the silence. For 5 years, I had poured every ounce of my energy into my marriage with Gavin. I was a mergers and acquisitions strategist and a corporate auditor, a career that required relentless precision and exhausting hours. When Gavin wanted to launch his tech company, CloudPeak, I was the one who drafted the business models. I secured the initial funding and managed every complicated financial audit. I stayed in the shadows, locked in my home office, while Gavin stepped into the spotlight to accept the praise and the magazine covers. He was the charismatic face of the operation, but I was the engine that kept it running. That dynamic had seemed fine to me until Gavin decided he no longer needed the engine opting, instead for a brutal divorce that stripped me of everything we had built together. The prenuptial agreement I had signed blindly in my mid-20s had just been upheld by the judge, leaving me with virtually nothing, or so my husband and his family believed. As I turned onto my quiet, tree-lined street, a knot of anticipation formed in my stomach. The imposing stone facade of the luxury estate I had shared with Gavin came into view. It was a beautiful property surrounded by manicured hedges and a sweeping driveway, a physical manifestation of all the late nights and sacrifices I had made. But as I pulled closer, the picturesque scene was shattered by a chaotic display on the front lawn. My mother-in-law, Barbara, and my sister-in-law, Chelsea, were marching across the wet grass. They were dragging heavy black garbage bags and aggressively dumping my belongings onto the lawn. The rain had softened the ground, and I could see my expensive designer suits, the ones I wore to secure our most critical corporate deals, spilling out onto the mud. Next to the ruined clothes were dozens of my heavy financial binders, their pages soaking up the cold rain. I parked the car and stepped out, the chill of the afternoon air biting through my thin jacket. I did not run, and I did not cry. I simply walked up the driveway with measured steps, watching these two women gleefully destroy my property. They had always resented my presence in Gavin's life, viewing me as a boring working-class accountant who was lucky to be associated with their legacy family. Now, they were finally getting their chance to physically purge me from their world. Barbara noticed me approaching and immediately marched up to the front porch, physically blocking the heavy wooden double doors. Her perfectly styled hair and expensive jewelry looked absurd against the backdrop of the garbage bags she had just been hauling. "Get out of my house!" she screamed, her voice carrying over the sound of the falling rain. "Do not ever set foot on this property again. Get out!" She crossed her arms, a look of absolute triumph settling over her harsh features. I stopped a few feet away from the porch, letting the rain fall on my shoulders. "I knew you would lose today." Savannah, Barbara continued, her tone dripping with venom. "My son is a brilliant man, and his lawyers are even better. That prenuptial agreement was rock solid. You walked into that courtroom thinking you could take half of his hard-earned empire, and you walked out with absolutely nothing. You are a nobody, and now you are a homeless nobody." She laughed, a sharp, grating sound that I had endured at countless family dinners. "You really thought you could outsmart us, did you not? You thought you could take advantage of my son's generosity. Well, the free ride is over. Gavin gets the house, he gets the company, and you get exactly what you brought into this marriage. Nothing." Before I could formulate a response, Chelsea emerged from the garage carrying another heavy cardboard box. It was filled with my audit files, years of meticulous financial records that had saved CloudPeak from bankruptcy on more than one occasion. Chelsea did not just set the box down. She lifted her leg and violently kicked the box straight down the sloping driveway. The cardboard tore open, scattering confidential financial textbooks, tax reports, and client ledgers across the wet pavement. You spent 5 years locked in a home office doing boring math, while my brother actually built an empire, Chelsea sneered, stepping up to stand beside her mother on the porch. She looked me up and down with utter disgust. You do not deserve to live in a mansion his genius paid for. You never did. You were just a glorified bookkeeper who got lucky. Gavin is a visionary, and you were just dragging him down with your constant nagging about budgets and compliance. Now he is finally free to soar without your dead weight holding him back. Her words were meant to break me, to reduce my 5 years of exhausting uncredited labor into an insignificant footnote in Gavin's success story. They truly believed that Gavin was a self-made titan and that my strategic auditing and late-night crisis management were entirely worthless. They thought they had won the ultimate victory. They thought I was standing there in the rain, broken and defeated, realizing that I had lost everything, but they were entirely wrong. I stood in silence, looking at the ruined pages of my textbooks stuck to the wet driveway. A normal person might have fallen to their knees, weeping over the injustice of it all. A normal person might have screamed back, defending their contributions and demanding respect from a family that was clearly incapable of giving it. But I was not going to waste my breath arguing with women who were too blinded by their own arrogance to understand how a business actually functioned. I let them savor their cruel moment of victory, let them enjoy the illusion of their superiority. The cold rain continued to wash over us, but I felt a strange warmth spreading through my chest. It was the warmth of absolute certainty. They had spent years underestimating my intelligence, assuming my quiet dedication was a sign of weakness. I slowly reached into my leather purse, my fingers brushing against a thick folded stack of notarized papers. The real power did not lie in yelling or throwing garbage bags on a lawn. The real power was hidden in the details they had always ignored. I stepped over a ruined navy blazer. The silk lining was already stained with dark brown mud, but I felt absolutely nothing for it. Clothes could be replaced. Dignity, however, was something you had to fight for. I walked straight up the stone path, my heels clicking softly against the wet pavement. Barbara and Chelsea stopped their frantic throwing, their chests heaving as they waited for my reaction. They wanted me to scream. They wanted me to fall apart right there on the grass, giving them the ultimate satisfaction of breaking me. Instead, I unclasped my purse. My hands were perfectly steady. I reached inside and my fingers traced the thick, textured paper of a legal envelope. I pulled it out and held it toward my mother-in-law. The heavy rain began to hit the crisp white paper, but the ink inside was permanently bound by a notary public. Barbara glared at the envelope, refusing to take it at first. She crossed her arms tighter over her chest, her diamond rings catching the dull gray light of the storm. She told me she was not interested in reading my pathetic pleas or whatever desperate settlement offer my cheap lawyer had cobbled together at the last minute. Chelsea laughed from the driveway, shouting that I should just take my trash and call a cab before they called the police for trespassing. I did not raise my voice. I simply pushed the envelope closer to Barbara until it brushed against her expensive cashmere sweater. I told her it was not a settlement offer. I told her it was an eviction notice. Barbara snatched the envelope from my hand with a scoff, tearing the flap open with her manicured nails. She pulled out the heavy stack of documents. Her eyes darted across the bold legal print at the top of the page. I watched the triumphant smirk slowly slide off her face, replaced by a deep, confusing frown. She muttered that this was some kind of mistake. She read aloud the name of a corporate holding company and demanded to know why I was handing her bank documents. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cool autumn air fill my lungs. I explained that I never intended to fight for this house during the divorce hearings. When Gavin brought his ruthless lawyers to the table and presented that ironclad prenuptial agreement, he thought he was protecting his assets. But he was actually blinding himself to the real financial situation of his own estate. For the past year, Gavin had been taking out massive secondary loans against this property to fund his extravagant lifestyle, assuming his booming tech company would always cover the margins. He ignored the fine print on his mortgages, missing payments and leveraging debt upon debt. 3 months ago, while Gavin was busy celebrating his supposed business genius and completely ignoring his financial obligations, the bank was preparing to sell off his defaulted loans. I told Barbara that I had set up an anonymous limited liability company to purchase that exact debt. I bought the paper on this house for pennies on the dollar because the bank wanted it off their books. I was his primary creditor, and because he had defaulted so severely, I had initiated foreclosure proceedings weeks before we even stepped into the divorce court today. Chelsea marched up the steps, snatching the papers from her mother's trembling hands. She stared at the signatures, the official state seals, and the final judgment of foreclosure. She stammered that it was impossible that Gavin owned the house free and clear, and that I was just a bitter ex-wife forging documents to scare them. I kept my voice completely level. I told Chelsea to read the bottom line. The foreclosure had been finalized yesterday afternoon. As the sole owner of the holding company that held the debt, the deed had been officially transferred to me. Gavin did not win the house in the divorce today because Gavin did not own the house anymore. I owned it. Barbara's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The reality of the paperwork in her hands was undeniable. The massive stone estate behind her, the very house she was trying to kick me out of, legally belonged to the woman she had just spent the last hour humiliating. I looked at the garbage bags strewn across the lawn. I told them they had exactly 1 hour to pick up my things, bring them inside, and pack their own bags instead. Before either of them could process the shock, the low, aggressive roar of a high-performance engine shattered the quiet suburban street. A sleek, brand-new sports car turned sharply into the driveway, its tires kicking up water as it sped toward the house. The car was painted a blinding custom red, screaming of sudden wealth and unchecked ego. The driver's side door swung open and Gavin stepped out. He was wearing a tailored designer suit, holding a large umbrella over his head to protect his perfectly styled hair from the rain. He looked like a man who had just conquered the world, utterly oblivious to the reality crashing down around him. He noticed the garbage bags on the lawn first. A wide, arrogant grin spread across his face as he walked up the driveway. He did not seem to care that his mother and sister were standing on the porch, looking completely pale and horrified. He only saw me standing in the rain, surrounded by what he assumed was my ruined life. He laughed, a loud and booming sound that echoed against the large stone walls of the house. He congratulated his mother and sister on taking out the trash. Gavin stopped a few feet away from me, twirling his expensive car keys around his index finger. He told me he was almost surprised to see me still standing here. He assumed I would be halfway across the city, heading to a cheap motel by now, crying over how badly I had lost in court. He bragged that his lawyers had destroyed me, that the prenuptial agreement had protected his entire empire, and that he was finally free of my constant boring nagging about budgets and audits. Barbara tried to interrupt him. She stepped forward, holding out the damp legal documents, her voice shaking as she tried to say his name. But Gavin waved her off too, caught up in his own narcissism, to read the room. He told his mother not to worry, that he had everything under control. He finally looked down at the papers in her hand and snatched them away, assuming they were just some desperate last-minute petition I was trying to serve him. He scanned the first page. He stopped twirling his keys. His eyes flicked back up to me, a mixture of confusion and sudden anger tightening his jaw. I did not say a word. I just let him read. He flipped to the second page, his eyes darting back and forth across the legal jargon. He read the name of my holding company, the foreclosure notice, and the final transfer of the deed. Gavin crumpled the papers in his fist, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. He threw the crumpled documents onto the wet porch. He stepped toward me, closing the distance, trying to use his height to intimidate me. He let out a harsh, dismissive laugh, trying to regain his footing. He called it a cute trick. He told me I was pathetic for sneaking around behind his back, buying up his bad debt, just to steal a house he did not even want anymore. He gestured wildly to his new sports car and the surrounding neighborhood. He boasted that he was the chief executive officer of Cloud Peak. He reminded me that his company was valued at hundreds of millions of dollars and his personal salary was massive. He claimed he could buy 10 estates better than this one by the end of the week. He said letting me have this house was just charity, A parting gift for a woman who would never achieve anything close to his level of success. He sneered, pointing a finger directly at my face. He told me to enjoy my empty, stolen house. He said he had an empire to run, an empire I would never be a part of again. He turned his broad back on me, grabbing his mother by the shoulder and aggressively telling her to get in his car right away. He said he was going to put them up in a 5-star hotel penthouse and buy them a new mansion by tomorrow. He was completely convinced that he was still the untouchable king of his corporate world. I stood perfectly still in the rain. I slowly lifted my left arm and checked my watch. The time was exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I let out a soft, genuine smile. I called out his name, my voice cutting cleanly through the sound of the rain and his arrogant ranting. Gavin stopped walking and turned around, looking at me with pure annoyance. I told him he was right about one thing. He was a very wealthy man with a massive salary up until about 5 minutes ago. I suggested he reach into his tailored suit pocket and check his work email. I told him he should probably read the message from the board of directors, the one that notified him that he had just been officially terminated as the chief executive officer of Cloud Peak. Gavin stared at me through the heavy rain. The arrogant smirk that had been plastered across his face just seconds ago began to falter. He stood completely frozen in the driveway while the cold water soaked into the shoulders of his expensive tailored suit. Barbara and Chelsea exchanged nervous glances on the porch, unsure of how to react to my sudden revelation. Gavin slowly reached into his interior pocket and pulled out his sleek smartphone. His thumb swiped across the screen, and the bright blue light illuminated his face in the gray afternoon gloom. I watched his eyes dart back and forth as he opened the urgent message from the board of directors. The color drained from his cheeks with every line he read. His tan skin turned a sickly pale shade of white, and his broad shoulders visibly slumped. For a few agonizing seconds, the untouchable tech king looked entirely broken. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the sound of the storm hitting the pavement. Then a sudden, jarring sound erupted from his chest. Gavin threw his head back and let out a loud, forced laugh. It was a harsh and manic sound that completely shattered the tension. He aggressively shoved his phone back into his pocket and took 2 large steps toward me. He shook his head, looking down at me with absolute pity. He told me I really was just a short-sighted bean counter who never understood the big picture. He bragged that I might have convinced a room full of stiff board members to terminate his contract, but I had fundamentally failed to understand how executive compensation actually worked. He turned toward the porch, loudly assuring his mother and sister that everything was still perfectly fine. He explained to them, and to me, that his contract with Cloud Peak was practically bulletproof. He had an ironclad golden parachute clause written into the very foundation of his employment agreement. He proudly declared that even if the board decided to oust him, to protect the company image, they were legally required to pay out his full severance package. He practically shouted that his termination meant he was now legally entitled to $20 million in cold, hard cash. Barbara let out a dramatic gasp of relief, clapping her hands together. Chelsea began to laugh, stepping off the porch to join her brother in the rain. Gavin turned his attention back to me, his confidence completely restored. He mocked my entire plan, saying my little corporate coup was entirely meaningless. He told me that by getting him fired, I had actually just handed him the biggest payday of his entire life. He boasted that he no longer had to work a single day, he no longer had to deal with investors, and he certainly no longer had to deal with me. He said $20 million was more than enough to buy a far better estate than the one I had just foreclosed on. He thanked me for doing the dirty work and securing his early retirement. Right as Gavin was taking a mock bow in the rain, the deep purr of a second luxury engine filled the quiet street. A pristine white luxury sports utility vehicle turned into the driveway, pulling up right behind Gavin's red sports car. The driver shifted the vehicle into park, and the heavy door swung open. Amber stepped out onto the wet pavement. She was Chelsea's best friend, but more importantly, she had been Gavin's secret mistress for the past 3 years. She looked like she had just stepped off a runway, wearing a pristine white designer coat, that somehow remained perfectly dry despite the storm. She held a massive designer umbrella over her head and walked toward us with the confidence of someone who believed she had won the grand prize. As she moved, the dull gray light caught a flash of brilliant sparkle on her wrist. She was flaunting a massive, incredibly expensive diamond tennis bracelet. It was a piece of jewelry that cost more than most people earned in an entire decade. Amber walked right up to Gavin and slid her arm through his, pressing her body against his damp suit. She looked at me with a sickeningly sweet smile, her eyes darting to the garbage bags full of my ruined clothes on the lawn. She let out a soft, mocking sigh and told me it was such a shame things had to end this way. She said she had always known Gavin was meant for bigger and better things than a boring auditor who spent all her time locked in a home office. Chelsea chimed in, telling Amber that I had just gotten Gavin fired. Amber did not look surprised or upset. Instead, her smile grew wider. She looked up at Gavin with pure adoration, bragging that they had been planning for this exact scenario. She turned back to me and gleefully explained that Gavin's $20 million severance package was going to fund their brand new life together. Amber boasted that they were moving to Miami by the end of the month. She detailed their plans to buy a waterfront mansion, purchase a luxury yacht, and launch a rival tech firm that would completely crush Cloud Peak. She rubbed the affair right in my face, claiming that Gavin had been promising her this life for years, and now my petty revenge had finally given them the cash to make it happen. Gavin wrapped his arm around Amber's waist, pulling her closer and kissing her cheek right in front of me. He told her she was absolutely right, and that they were going to celebrate tonight with the most expensive champagne in the city. They stood there, a united front of greed and betrayal, convinced that they had outmaneuvered me at every single turn. Amber held up her wrist intentionally, showing off the heavy diamond tennis bracelet. She let out a sharp, condescending laugh. She told me I really was the most gullible woman on the planet. She asked if I remembered the massive cash flow crisis Cloud Peak faced last year, the time when the company was supposedly on the brink of total bankruptcy. I remembered it perfectly. I had worked long hours trying to balance the books and appease the anxious vendors. Amber mocked me for taking a voluntary salary cut during that crisis. She laughed as she recalled how I had given up my entire paycheck for 6 months just to help Gavin keep his struggling company afloat. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a vicious whisper. She proudly noted that Gavin had purchased this exact diamond tennis bracelet for her during that exact same week. The sheer financial and emotional abuse of her statement hung in the cold air. While I was draining my own savings and working myself to the bone to save his company, Gavin was using corporate funds to buy hundreds of thousands of dollars in jewelry for his mistress. Amber smirked, telling me that my sacrifice had paid for her luxury lifestyle. She said Gavin had always known how to manipulate my sense of loyalty and duty. Barbara and Chelsea laughed from the sidelines, entirely complicit in the horrible deception. They all looked at me, waiting for me to finally break down and cry over the ultimate betrayal. They expected me to fall to my knees, crushed by the realization that my loyalty had been used to fund the woman who destroyed my marriage. I stood my ground, feeling the cold rain run down my face. I did not shed a single tear. I just kept my eyes locked on the diamond bracelet, preparing my next move. I slowly lowered my gaze from Amber's sparkling wrist to the black leather briefcase, resting heavily against my leg. It was the exact same briefcase I had faithfully carried into the Cloud Peak corporate offices every single morning for the last 5 long years. I knelt down on the cold, wet concrete, feeling the freezing rain immediately seeping through the fabric at the knees of my slacks, and smoothly unzipped the main compartment. Gavin let out a loud, heavy sigh, shifting his body weight around impatiently on his expensive leather shoes. He told me to stop dragging this entire situation out any further, loudly complaining that the relentless pouring rain was going to completely ruin the expensive custom paint job on his brand new sports car. I completely ignored his pathetic, childish whining. I reached deep inside the dark bag and carefully pulled out a massive, heavily bound document that weighed several pounds. The cover was thick premium stock paper, and right in the center, stamped in bright, undeniable red ink, were the bold words, "Forensic Audit." I stood back up to my full height, holding the heavy binder securely in both hands. The rain began to hit the cover hard, but the thick protective binding kept the hundreds of pages perfectly safe and dry. I held it out steadily toward Gavin, but I deliberately did not hand it over to him. I just let him clearly see the terrifying title. His widened eyes immediately locked onto the bright red letters, and the smug, overly arrogant smile that had been permanently fixed to his handsome face finally began to crack. I asked Gavin if he remembered the specific wording of his executive employment contract. I reminded him that I was the one who had stayed up until 3 in the morning negotiating the terms with our corporate lawyers while he was out celebrating his new title. I told him that his golden parachute was a remarkable piece of legal protection that guaranteed him $20 million in severance if the board of directors ever decided to move in a different direction. But I continued keeping my voice level and calm. There was a standard termination for cause clause hidden within the fine print. I explained to him that golden parachutes are legally voided when a chief executive officer is terminated for a felony. Gavin swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He tried to puff out his chest, stepping away from Amber to confront me. He demanded to know what I was talking about, insisting that he had never committed a crime in his life, and that my little audit report was nothing but a fabrication. I shook my head slowly, feeling a sense of pity for a man who had underestimated the woman who managed his money. I told him the termination code on his human resources file was not for poor performance or a difference in creative vision. He was officially terminated for gross financial misconduct and felony embezzlement. Barbara let out a sharp gasp from the front porch, her hand flying up to cover her mouth. Chelsea stopped laughing, her eyes darting between her brother and me. Gavin opened his mouth to shout another denial, but I cut him off. I told him I had spent the last year secretly tracing his financial movements. Every time he went on a business trip, every time he claimed to be entertaining foreign investors, I was quietly tracking the corporate credit cards and hidden offshore accounts. I explained to the 3 women standing in the cold rain that Gavin had set up a network of dummy vendor accounts within the Cloud Peak payroll system. He was siphoning company revenue and redirecting it into a private slush fund. I looked directly at Amber, whose confident posture was rapidly deflating into fear. I told her that the diamond tennis bracelet sparkling on her wrist had not been purchased with Gavin's personal wealth. It was bought using funds intended for employee health benefits and quarterly bonuses. I then looked at Barbara, who was leaning against the wooden porch railing. I informed her that the country club membership she had been flaunting, the one that cost $80,000 a year to maintain, was paid for by the company's research and development budget. I detailed how I had gathered every receipt, every wire transfer, and every forged invoice, compiling them all into the report I was holding. I told them I had proof that the visionary of Cloud Peak was a thief stealing from his own company to fund his mistress and his mother. Gavin was breathing heavily now, his fists clenched at his sides. He took a step toward me, his voice dropping to a desperate growl. He told me that even if I had manufactured this fake report, the board of directors would never want to risk a public scandal. He insisted they would pay him off and sweep the thing under the rug to protect the company's stock price. He said I had wasted my time because corporate America always protects its own. I looked him in the eye and let out a soft laugh. I told him I agreed with him. I told him the board wanted to keep this quiet. In fact, they had practically begged me to handle this internally when I presented my findings to them at 6 o'clock this morning. But I explained that I was not a disgruntled ex-wife looking for a quick payout. I was a certified public accountant and a lead corporate auditor, which meant I was legally bound to report financial crimes. I took a step closer, my voice cutting through the heavy rain with clarity. I told Gavin that I did not just hand this forensic audit to the board of directors. I had also handed a copy to the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Gavin stumbled backward as if I had struck him. He looked back at his mother, then over at Amber, terror washing over his face. He knew exactly what federal involvement meant. It meant prison. Amber dropped Gavin's arm, stepping away from him as if he had caught a contagious disease. Her eyes were wide with panic, her umbrella shaking in her grip. She stammered, asking what that meant for her, insisting that she had nothing to do with how Gavin managed his business affairs. I turned my attention to Amber, taking in her white coat and the stolen diamonds on her wrist. I told her that when the federal government opens an embezzlement and tax fraud investigation, the first thing they do is secure the stolen assets. They track down exactly where the money went, and they lock it down to prevent suspects from fleeing the country. I offered her a polite, hollow smile. I advised her to reach into her handbag and pull out her phone. I suggested she open her mobile banking application and check her account balances. Amber dug into her purse, her nails struggling to grip her phone in the rain. She tapped the screen, her breath hitching in her throat as the application loaded. She stared at the digital display for 5 seconds. The color drained from her face. Her mouth opened wide, and a piercing scream ripped through the street. She dropped her phone onto the wet driveway, staring in horror at the screen that showed all her bank accounts had been frozen by the federal government. For several seconds, nobody moved. Gavin stared at Amber's fallen phone as if he could force the numbers on the screen to change through sheer anger. Then he snapped that the banking application was obviously malfunctioning. He claimed the storm had disrupted the network and ordered Amber to restart the device. His voice was loud, but it no longer carried authority. It carried panic. I opened the forensic report to the executive summary and turned it toward him. I told him the freeze was not based on an anonymous complaint or a temporary software error. It had been authorized after investigators matched 214 transfers from Cloud Peak operating accounts to vendors that had no employees, no offices, and no legitimate contracts. Those vendors had then routed the money into accounts connected to Gavin Amber and members of his family. The investigators had already obtained the banking records before he received his termination notice. Nothing happening in the driveway was creating the case. The case already existed. Gavin lunged for the binder. I stepped aside before his hand reached it. His polished shoe slid on the wet stone and he nearly fell against the hood of his red sports car. Chelsea rushed forward to steady him while Barbara shouted that I had assaulted her son. I calmly reminded them that 3 exterior security cameras were recording every movement on the property. I also explained that the binder in my hands was only a presentation copy. The original evidence had been preserved by an independent digital forensics firm, duplicated onto secure government servers, and authenticated through a documented chain of custody. Even if Gavin managed to tear every page into pieces, he would destroy nothing except another piece of property that now belonged to me. His eyes moved toward the cameras mounted beneath the roofline. For the first time, he seemed aware that the house itself was no longer protecting him. I turned several pages and showed him a schedule of the company accounts he had raided. The numbers were devastating, but numbers alone could still feel abstract to someone like Gavin. So I told him what they meant. The employee medical reserve he had used to purchase Amber's bracelet had been created because one of Cloud Peak's senior engineers had a daughter undergoing treatment for leukemia. The quarterly bonus pool he diverted into the Miami Slush Fund included money promised to junior programmers who had worked nights and weekends through a failed product launch. The research budget that paid for Barbara's country club membership had been approved to hire 12 new graduates who had already signed leases near the office. Those positions had been canceled when Gavin claimed the company needed to conserve cash. Gavin told me to stop performing for an audience. He said employees were replaceable and that every chief executive used discretionary funds to maintain relationships. I watched the faces around him change. Amber looked down at the bracelet as though it had suddenly become something poisonous. Even Chelsea seemed disturbed for half a second, though she quickly hid it beneath a sneer. I told Gavin that the problem was not poor judgment. The problem was intent. He had created false invoices, approved payments to companies he secretly controlled, and instructed subordinates to classify personal purchases as legitimate business expenses. He had then signed quarterly certifications, declaring that the financial statements were accurate. Each signature converted his excuses into evidence. A white utility vehicle turned onto the street and stopped at the edge of the driveway. Two licensed asset recovery officers stepped out wearing reflective rain jackets. Behind them came a court process server carrying a waterproof document case. Gavin stared at the vehicle, then at me, and demanded to know what else I had arranged. I told him I had arranged nothing theatrical. I had simply provided accurate information to the people legally responsible for protecting the company. The process server approached Gavin and formally handed him an emergency preservation order. The order prohibited him from selling, transferring, damaging, or concealing any property purchased with disputed corporate funds. Gavin barely glanced at the first page before crumpling it in his fist. The server calmly informed him that destroying his copy did not invalidate the order, and that a second copy had already been delivered electronically to his attorneys. One of the recovery officers walked toward the red sports car and photographed the vehicle identification number through the windshield. Gavin immediately stepped in front of him. He shouted that the car was personal property and threatened to have both men arrested for trespassing. I opened the audit to another tab and read the registration information aloud. The vehicle had not been purchased in Gavin's name. It had been leased through Northridge Systems Consulting, one of the dummy vendors receiving payments from Cloud Peak's infrastructure budget. The insurance premiums, customization work, and monthly lease payments had all been charged to the company. The officer held out his hand and requested the keys. Gavin tightened his fist around them. For a moment I thought he might do something reckless. His face twisted with humiliation as he looked at the car he had driven into the driveway like a symbol of victory. Barbara ordered him not to surrender anything. Chelsea began filming the officers with her phone, loudly claiming the family was being robbed. The process server warned her that interfering with the recovery of restrained assets could expose her to the same investigation. That warning ended her performance. Gavin finally threw the keys onto the pavement. They landed in a shallow puddle with a metallic splash. The recovery officer picked them up, inspected the car, and placed an official seizure notice beneath the windshield wiper. Gavin watched in silence as the vehicle's alarm chirped and the officer entered the driver's seat. Amber suddenly began clawing at the clasp of her diamond bracelet. Her wet fingers slipped against the metal, and she whispered that she had never asked where the money came from. I told her not to remove, hide, or give the bracelet to anyone. The process server handed her a separate notice identifying the jewelry as traceable property subject to forfeiture. He explained that she could arrange voluntary surrender through counsel or risk having agents collect it directly. Amber looked toward Gavin for reassurance. He gave her none. He was staring at the red car as it rolled backward down the driveway, his expression empty. Barbara accused me of enjoying their humiliation. I told her I took no pleasure in watching property disappear. I had spent years watching Cloud Peak employees lose bonuses, opportunities, and security while her family treated corporate accounts like a private inheritance. What she called humiliation was simply the visible return of things that had never belonged to them. The recovery vehicle pulled away, taking Gavin's most obvious trophy with it. The rain filled the silence left behind. No one laughed now. No one mentioned Miami yachts, penthouses, or $20 million. Their future had narrowed to legal notices, frozen assets, and questions they could no longer avoid. Then every face turned back toward the cracked phone lying at Amber's feet, its bright screen still displaying the same unmoving balances. Amber stared at the shattered screen of her phone resting on the wet asphalt. Her hands were shaking violently as the reality of the federal freeze washed over her. But the shock only lasted for a fleeting moment before Chelsea grabbed her best friend by the shoulder and pulled her back toward the porch. Chelsea shot me a look of pure, concentrated venom. She wrapped her arm protectively around Amber and loudly declared that I was completely delusional if I thought a temporary bank freeze was going to ruin them. Chelsea yelled over the sound of the rain that I was just a middle-class calculator pusher who was way out of my depth. She scoffed at the idea that I could ever truly outsmart a wealthy legacy family with deep societal roots. Amber quickly wiped the rain from her face and clung to Chelsea, her panic morphing into a sneering defensive arrogance. Amber shouted that Barbara had already secured the absolute best corporate defense lawyers in the entire state of Illinois. She reminded me of the massive line of credit Barbara had just bragged about taking out against the generational family trust. Amber pointed a manicured finger at me, mocking my supposedly stupid belief that a simple auditor could ever compete with the kind of limitless generational wealth their family possessed. She bragged that their legal team would tie me up in court for the next 30 years, burying me under so many defamation lawsuits that I would not even be able to afford a public defender. Gavin seemed to draw an immense amount of strength from the vicious confidence of the women standing behind him. He rolled his shoulders back, shaking the rainwater from his expensive suit jacket, and took a slow, deliberate step toward me. The color had returned to his face, replacing the pale terror with his signature brand of toxic arrogance. He crossed his arms over his chest and let out a deep, patronizing sigh. He told me that Chelsea and Amber were absolutely right. He said my little stunt with the federal investigators was nothing more than a minor speed bump for a man of his stature. Gavin leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a menacing, threatening tone. He promised me that he was going to dedicate every single waking moment of his life to dragging my professional name through the deepest mud he could find. He swore that he would use every connection he had in the tech industry, every investor he had ever shaken hands with, and every media contact on his payroll to brand me as an unstable, hysterical, and deeply vindictive ex-wife who fabricated financial documents out of pure jealousy. Gavin laughed, a harsh sound that cut through the chilly afternoon air. He told me that by the time his public relations team was done with me, my reputation would be so completely destroyed that I would never work in corporate America again. He bragged that no accounting firm, no tech startup, and no merger and acquisition agency would ever touch my resume. He smiled, his eyes gleaming with malice, and told me I would be lucky to find a job managing the cash register at a local fast food drive-thru when he was finished destroying my life. I stood my ground, holding the heavy binder against my chest. The rain continued to fall, soaking my hair, but I felt an overwhelming sense of calm radiating from my chest. I did not raise my voice to match his shouting. I did not flinch at his threats of professional ruin. I looked at him with a gentle, pitying smile. I told Gavin that he was making a very large assumption about who exactly was holding the power in this dynamic. I told him that while he was busy planning his grand media revenge tour and hiding behind his mother's supposedly limitless trust fund, I had been busy restructuring the very foundation of his family's wealth. Right as Gavin opened his mouth to deliver another arrogant insult, a sharp, crisp, ringing sound emerged from the pocket of my damp blazer. The timing was so incredibly perfect that it almost felt choreographed. I slowly reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. The screen was brightly illuminated, displaying an incoming call from a private number. I held the phone up so Gavin could clearly see the screen. I told him that I had been waiting for this specific phone call all afternoon. With a deliberate, measured movement, I swiped my thumb across the glass screen to accept the call and firmly pressed the speakerphone button. I turned the volume all the way up, holding the device out so the sound would carry perfectly over the noise of the pouring rain. A deep, highly professional, and distinctly authoritative male voice echoed from the small speaker. The man greeted me by my first name, his tone conveying a deep sense of respect and urgency. I greeted him back and asked him to please identify himself for the benefit of the other people standing in the driveway. The man cleared his throat and formally announced that his name was Harrison. He stated that he was the senior managing partner of the exact same elite corporate defense law firm that Barbara had just bragged about hiring mere moments ago. Barbara let out a sharp, sudden gasp from the top step of the porch. Her hands immediately flew to her chest, her fingers clutching the damp fabric of her cashmere sweater. She stared at my phone with wide, terrified eyes, clearly unable to comprehend why the senior partner of her newly retained, highly expensive legal defense team was currently on a first-name basis with the woman she was trying to destroy. Chelsea and Amber fell completely silent, their previous mocking laughter dying instantly in their throats. Gavin took a slow, hesitant step backward, his gaze darting nervously between the phone in my hand and my perfectly calm face. He demanded to know what was going on, shouting at the phone and asking Harrison why he was calling his ex-wife. Harrison completely ignored Gavin's frantic shouting. He maintained his professional measured cadence, directing his words entirely to me. He announced that he was calling to provide a final official update on the financial maneuver we had initiated earlier this week. He stated that the complex acquisition papers had just been fully executed and filed with the state regulatory board. He formally confirmed that the acquisition of the private banking institution, the specific holding bank that managed and maintained the entirety of Gavin's generational family trust, was now 100% complete. Harrison congratulated me on the successful acquisition, noting that all outstanding debts, liabilities, and leveraged credit lines associated with that specific bank were now under my direct, exclusive legal control. I calmly tapped the screen, ending the phone call, and let the heavy silence stretch across the driveway. I looked directly at a completely horrified Barbara, whose legs were trembling so badly she had to grab the wooden railing to keep from collapsing. I told her that she did not borrow that massive amount of money from a traditional corporate bank. I revealed that she had unknowingly borrowed it from my private holding company, and I was calling in the entirety of the debt immediately. The sheer terror that washed over Barbara was a picture I would keep stored in my memory for the rest of my life. Her knees finally gave out, sending her collapsing onto the wet wooden steps of the porch, but I did not stay to watch her cry. I simply turned my back on the three of them, walked to my car, and drove away from the estate, leaving them standing in the freezing rain, with the absolute certainty that their reign of manipulation had come to a permanent end. The storm raged on through the night, matching the turbulent shift in power. But by the time the sun rose the following morning, the skies over Chicago had completely cleared. The crisp autumn air felt sharp and revitalizing as I stepped out of my town car and walked through the towering glass doors of the Cloud Peak corporate headquarters. For 5 years I had entered this building through the side doors, clutching my heavy audit binders and keeping my head down while I marched straight to the accounting department. Today, I walked directly into the main lobby, bypassing the visitor desk and stepping into the private executive elevator. I rode up to the 50th floor, feeling a profound sense of ownership with every floor the elevator climbed. The heavy mahogany doors of the primary boardroom stood open, revealing a sprawling space designed specifically to intimidate. A massive table carved from a single piece of dark walnut dominated the room, surrounded by 24 plush leather chairs. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding, unobstructed view of the city skyline. I walked straight to the head of the table, the chair that had always been exclusively reserved for the chief executive officer. I sat down, smoothed the fabric of my tailored gray suit, and placed my sleek laptop on the polished wood. I was early, but I wanted to be perfectly settled when the reality of the situation finally caught up to my ex-husband. Over the next 30 minutes, the most powerful venture capitalists and angel investors in the city began to file into the room. These were wealthy, pragmatic men and women who controlled billions of dollars in tech sector investments. They took their seats, murmuring quietly among themselves, casting curious glances in my direction. They had received the emergency meeting summons late last night, detailing a severe restructuring of the company leadership. Many of them knew me only as the quiet financial strategist who occasionally presented quarterly earnings reports. They certainly did not expect to see me sitting in the seat of power. I did not offer any immediate explanations. I simply offered polite professional nods as the room filled to capacity. The air was thick with tension and unspoken questions. The investors opened their leather portfolios, taking out their silver pens, and preparing to demand answers about their massive financial stakes in Cloud Peak. Just as the senior board chairman cleared his throat to officially call the emergency session to order, a loud commotion erupted in the reception area outside the heavy wooden doors. The muffled sounds of shouting and struggling echoed through the thick walls, followed instantly by the violent sound of the boardroom doors being shoved open so hard they slammed against the drywall. Gavin burst into the room breathing heavily, his face flushed with a mixture of exhaustion and unhinged rage. He was not alone. He had dragged Barbara and Chelsea past the lobby security team, bringing his mother and sister into a highly confidential corporate meeting. Gavin looked nothing like the polished, charismatic leader these investors were used to seeing. His tie was loose, his hair was disheveled, and his eyes were heavily bloodshot from what I could only assume was a terrifying, sleepless night, spent frantically trying to find a legal loophole that simply did not exist. He marched straight toward the head of the table, his heavy footsteps thudding aggressively against the carpet. He slammed both of his fists down onto the polished walnut surface with such incredible force that several of the investors physically jumped in their seats. Gavin ignored the shocked gasps of the board members and pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. He began to scream, demanding that the building security guards enter the room and arrest me immediately for corporate espionage and theft. He shouted that I had illegally hijacked the meeting and that I had absolutely no right to be sitting in his chair. I did not flinch at the sound of his fists hitting the table, nor did I react to his screaming. I simply leaned back in the plush leather chair, folding my hands neatly in my lap, and let him make a complete spectacle of himself in front of the very people who controlled his company funding. The board members exchanged deeply disturbed glances. The senior chairman stood up, adjusting his glasses, and sternly warned Gavin that his behavior was entirely unacceptable and that his termination was already a matter of legal record. This official confirmation of his firing only poured gasoline on the fire. Before Gavin could launch into another aggressive tirade, Barbara pushed her way past her son and threw herself into the center of the room. She was fully prepared to execute the manipulative performance of a lifetime. Barbara clutched her expensive handbag to her chest, intentionally trembling as she looked around at the circle of wealthy, influential investors. She forced tears to well up in her eyes, letting them spill dramatically over her carefully applied makeup. She raised her voice, projecting a tone of absolute maternal heartbreak, and cried out that they were all making a terrible, tragic mistake. She pointed a manicured finger at me and told the entire boardroom that I was nothing more than a hysterical, deeply jealous ex-wife who was acting out of pure, unadulterated spite. She sobbed, weaving a fabricated tale about how her brilliant son had worked himself to the bone to build Cloud Peak from the ground up, sacrificing his health and his marriage for the sake of these investors. She claimed that I had become dangerously obsessed with ruining him simply because he had finally found the courage to leave a toxic, loveless marriage. Barbara paced back and forth at the foot of the massive walnut table, making sure she made eye contact with every single board member. She begged them not to listen to the fraudulent lies I had supposedly manufactured. She insisted that I had spent the last year secretly fabricating financial documents and forging audit reports just to steal her son's brilliant, groundbreaking innovations. She wailed that I was a manipulative gold digger who was trying to orchestrate a hostile takeover of a company I did not even understand. Chelsea stood by the doors, nodding vigorously and dabbing at her own dry eyes, playing the role of the supportive, traumatized sister. She chimed in, telling the investors that I had always been insanely envious of Gavin's natural intellect, and that this entire situation was just a pathetic attempt to steal the spotlight. Gavin stood tall, letting his mother and sister paint him as the ultimate victim of a scorned woman's wrath. He looked around the room, expecting the wealthy men and women at the table to immediately rally behind him to throw me out of the building and to restore him to his rightful place as their golden boy. But the investors did not look sympathetic at all. They looked profoundly irritated. They were seasoned business professionals who cared strictly about profit margins, corporate liability, and hard data, not suburban family melodrama or pathetic theatrical displays. I sat quietly at the head of the immense boardroom table, listening to the echoing sounds of Barbara's fake sobs, and I calmly allowed the heavy silence to stretch just long enough to make them feel the rapidly shifting energy in the room. I allowed Barbara's accusation to remain unanswered for several seconds. Then I reached for the slim conference telephone in the center of the table and pressed a single illuminated button. The side door opened and 3 people entered the boardroom. The first was Marisol Chen, Cloud Peak's independent general counsel. She carried a sealed evidence case and wore the expression of someone who had spent the entire night preparing for a confrontation. Behind her came the lead partner from an outside forensic accounting firm and the company's director of human resources. None of them looked surprised to see Gavin, Barbara, or Chelsea in the room. Marisol placed the evidence case on the table and formally stated that the emergency meeting had been convened under the company bylaws after the audit committee received credible evidence of executive misconduct. She explained that my presence was not the result of trespassing, espionage, or a private marital dispute. I had been appointed special restructuring officer by a unanimous written consent of the non-conflicted directors. Until the board completed its review, I had authority to protect company records, preserve intellectual property, suspend compromised accounts, and present evidence to the investors. Gavin interrupted her before she finished. He shouted that any vote taken without him was invalid because he was the founder and largest shareholder. Marisol did not argue. She opened a folder and slid a certified copy of the company bylaws across the table. She pointed to the conflict provision Gavin himself had approved during the last financing round. An officer under investigation for fraud could not participate in a vote concerning his own removal, indemnification, or access to corporate systems. Gavin refused to look at the page. He said lawyers could interpret documents however they wanted and demanded an immediate shareholder vote to restore him as chief executive officer. The outside auditor opened the evidence case. Inside were 2 encrypted drives, several notarized chain of custody forms, and a series of bank confirmations obtained directly from financial institutions. He explained that his firm had independently reproduced the central findings of my forensic audit. The transfers had not been created on my laptop, inserted into a company server, or altered after the divorce. They had been verified against records held by banks' payment processors, vendors, and the company's own insurance carriers. One investor near the center of the table asked the question Gavin had been avoiding since he entered the room. He wanted to know whether company money had actually been used for personal purchases. The auditor answered with clinical precision. He confirmed that millions of dollars had moved through sham vendors. He confirmed that several invoices described software services that were never delivered. He confirmed that the beneficial owner of 2 vendors was Gavin and that another was controlled by an associate of Amber. He did not mention gossip, marriage, or betrayal. He simply described dates, account numbers, approval codes, and false classifications. The investor closed his portfolio and looked at Gavin with open disgust. Barbara rushed to her son's defense. She claimed that successful executives routinely used complicated entities for tax planning, and that I had always been too rigid to understand sophisticated wealth management. Marisol asked Barbara whether she was an officer-director employee or authorized financial advisor to Cloud Peak. Barbara faltered. She admitted she was none of those things. Marisol then asked why several payments from Cloud Peak had been routed to a private club account bearing Barbara's membership number. Barbara's face tightened. She said Gavin had given her gifts and that a mother had no obligation to audit her son's generosity. The outside auditor calmly replied that recipients could still be required to return property purchased with misappropriated funds, especially after receiving notice of the investigation. Chelsea stepped away from the door and raised her phone, apparently trying to live stream the confrontation. The Human Resources Director immediately informed her that the meeting concerned protected personnel information and active law enforcement referrals. Building security would confiscate the device if she continued recording. Chelsea lowered the phone, but not before several board members saw the social media application open on the screen. The chairman asked why the warning signs had not reached the full board earlier. That was the question I had expected. I explained that Gavin had gradually dismantled the company's internal controls. He reassigned experienced accounting staff, centralized vendor approval under his office, and instructed department leaders to treat his requests as confidential strategic expenditures. Whenever I raised discrepancies, he told the board that I was overly cautious and emotionally incapable of supporting rapid growth. He used our marriage to undermine my professional credibility. In private, he called my warnings disloyal. In public, he presented my work as his own. The Human Resources Director then distributed copies of 3 internal complaints. One came from a payroll manager who had been ordered to issue payments without tax documentation. Another came from a procurement analyst who discovered that a supposed cloud security contractor had no website employees or commercial address. The third came from a junior accountant who had been threatened with termination after asking why an employee benefit account was paying a luxury jeweler. Each complaint had been redirected to Gavin's executive office. None had reached the audit committee. Gavin accused the employees of conspiring with me. He said disgruntled workers would say anything to protect their jobs. The Human Resources Director replied that 2 of the complainants had resigned months before the divorce became public. Their original emails, metadata, and exit interviews had already been preserved. They had no reason to fabricate a story for a woman they did not know was investigating the same transactions. A venture capitalist at the far end of the table asked Gavin to explain one payment to Northridge Systems Consulting. The invoice claimed the vendor had performed emergency infrastructure work over a holiday weekend. The investor wanted the name of the project manager, the location of the work, and the final technical report. Gavin stared at the invoice. He said he could not be expected to remember every operational detail from a company of Cloud Peak's size. The auditor placed a photograph of Gavin's red sports car beside the invoice. The vehicle identification number appeared on the supporting lease documents. The room went completely still. Gavin pushed the photograph away and said the car had been part of an executive compensation arrangement. Marisol asked him to identify the board resolution approving it. He could not. She asked him to identify the compensation committee disclosure. He could not. She asked why the lease had been coded as data center redundancy instead of executive transportation. He had no answer. The chairman removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Around the table, investors began quietly comparing the audit schedules with the financing reports they had received during the previous year. The anger in the room was no longer theoretical. They could see that decisions involving their capital had been based on false information. I told them that my purpose was not to demand blind trust. Every document in the room could be tested. Every bank confirmation could be obtained again. Every digital record included its original metadata. I had asked the outside firm to challenge my findings, not endorse them. They had spent weeks searching for an innocent explanation and had found none. Gavin seized on the word weeks. He pointed at me and shouted that the timing proved I had planned the entire investigation as revenge for the divorce. I agreed that I had planned carefully. I had done so because accusing a chief executive officer without complete evidence would have endangered employees, investors, and the company itself. Careful preparation was not proof of malice. It was the reason Cloud Peak still had enough cash to survive his misconduct. Barbara moved closer to the table, abandoning her tears for a moment. She warned the investors that removing Gavin would destroy public confidence. She reminded them of his magazine covers, television interviews, and relationships with major clients. She insisted that the market believed in her son, not in an unknown auditor who had spent her career behind closed doors. Several investors looked toward me, waiting. I told them the company's future should not depend on anyone's charm, including mine. It should depend on verifiable assets, enforceable rights, competent leadership, and honest reporting. If the evidence showed that I had acted improperly, I would submit to the same scrutiny I was demanding of Gavin. But no founder, spouse, mother, or investor was entitled to operate above the controls designed to protect everyone else. Barbara's expression changed when she realized I was not going to trade insults with her. She returned to the role she understood best. Her shoulders began to shake again. She turned toward the chairman, pressed one hand dramatically against her heart, and pleaded with him to remember the young, ambitious man he had once supported. She asked him to ignore the documents for one compassionate moment and see a devoted son whose family was being torn apart by a vindictive former wife. She waited for sympathy to rescue him. The senior board chairman did not look at Barbara with pity. He looked at her with profound annoyance, crossing his arms over his chest. Gavin realized his mother's theatrical display was failing to sway the room. He stepped in front of her, blocking her from the gaze of the wealthy investors, and desperately attempted to salvage the disastrous situation by doing the only thing he had ever mastered. He began to aggressively sell himself. Gavin puffed out his chest and adjusted his expensive silk tie. He lowered his voice, adopting the smooth cadence of a tech founder pitching to eager billionaires. He told the investors that minor family disputes were entirely irrelevant to the future profitability of the company. He forcefully insisted that he was the sole creative force behind CloudPeak and the only person capable of guiding the enterprise safely through the critical fiscal quarter. To prove his point, Gavin launched into an aggressive, deeply technical explanation of the proprietary software architecture that had recently doubled the company's valuation. He paced back and forth, gesturing wildly as he rattled off a dense string of industry buzzwords. He talked loudly about predictive machine learning algorithms, dynamic cloud scaling infrastructure, and encrypted blockchain data processing. He proudly claimed that he had spent the last 3 years locked inside his office, tirelessly writing the core architecture line by line while the rest of the industry was sleeping. He boasted that the software was his ultimate masterpiece, a digital ecosystem so complex that no other engineer could possibly understand it. He looked directly at the senior chairman, demanding to know how they could ever consider removing the very architect who had built the highly profitable foundation of their entire investment portfolio. Chelsea clapped her hands from the open doorway, her face beaming with arrogant pride. She agreed with her brother, telling the skeptical investors that Gavin was a certified genius and that the company would collapse into bankruptcy the second he walked out the door. The venture capitalists sitting around the walnut table remained entirely silent. Some of them began to take detailed notes on their legal pads, their facial expressions unreadable. I waited patiently for Gavin to finish his desperate, breathless monologue. When he finally paused to take a deep breath, assuming he had successfully dazzled the room with his technical vocabulary, I gently tapped the polished wood of the table. I asked Gavin a simple, direct question. I asked him to thoroughly explain the compiling sequence required to integrate the legacy code with the new predictive algorithms he had just bragged about building from scratch. Gavin froze instantly. The confident smile completely vanished from his face. He blinked several times, his eyes darting nervously around the painfully silent boardroom. He opened his mouth, closed it again, and let out a sharp, dismissive laugh. He told me that this was an executive meeting, not a freshman computer science pop quiz. He aggressively claimed he did not have to explain his proprietary methods to an angry ex-wife who barely knew how to operate a standard accounting spreadsheet. He quickly turned his back on me and faced the investors again, attempting to change the subject back to the quarterly revenue projections. The senior chairman immediately raised his hand, gesturing firmly for Gavin to stop talking right now. The chairman looked at me, nodding politely, and asked me to please continue with my assessment. I stood up slowly from my leather executive chair and pressed a single button on my laptop keyboard. The massive digital projector screen hanging on the wall directly behind Gavin immediately flickered to life. The bright white light illuminated the entire boardroom, casting a harsh glow over my ex-husband's sweating face. The screen displayed a massive, incredibly detailed blueprint of the CloudPeak core software architecture. I did not raise my voice, nor did I show any trace of anger or resentment. I spoke with the calm, methodical, and ruthless precision of a professional corporate auditor presenting irrefutable facts. I pointed to the screen and explained to the investors that Gavin could not answer my basic technical question about the compiling sequence because Gavin did not write a single line of that software. I revealed to the room that Gavin lacked even a fundamental understanding of modern software engineering and that his technical vocabulary consisted of empty buzzwords he had memorized from trade magazines. Gavin shouted that I was lying, slamming his fist on the table, demanding that the projector be turned off immediately. I ignored his tantrum entirely. I tapped my laptop keyboard a second time, and the screen shifted to display a series of secure, time-stamped patent filings and thousands of pages of raw, uncompiled source code. I told the boardroom that the original code had been submitted to the patent office under a hidden digital pseudonym to protect the intellectual property, during the early stages of development. I zoomed in on the official government patent documents, highlighting the hidden developer signature embedded within the digital watermark. The signature did not belong to Gavin. I opened a secure server on my laptop, a server registered exclusively under my name, and ran a live decryption sequence in front of the investors. The screen instantly verified that my private server held the original cryptographic keys to every piece of profitable technology CloudPeak had ever produced. I turned to look at Gavin, whose face had gone entirely gray. I told the room that while Gavin was out spending company money on luxury sports cars and lavish international trips with his mistress, I was the one staying up until dawn, writing the software that made them all extraordinarily wealthy. I definitively proved that I was the unseen architect, the sole legal author of the technology, and the only person in the room who actually understood how to keep the company running smoothly. The entire boardroom erupted into a flurry of angry whispers as the investors stared at the undeniable proof projected brightly on the wall. The carefully crafted illusion of the charismatic tech genius was completely shattered into a million tiny, unrecoverable pieces. Gavin was officially exposed not just as a financial thief who had stolen money from his staff, but as a total technical fraud who had built an entire massive corporate empire solely on the back of his wife's exhausting labor. The senior board chairman slammed his hand flat against the walnut table, instantly silencing the panicked room. He stood up slowly, towering over the space, and looked at Gavin with an expression of pure, absolute disgust. The chairman told Gavin that the board of directors had seen absolutely enough to make a final, irrevocable decision today. He formally announced to the room that the company was officially preparing to press federal charges against him for fraud, corporate espionage, and embezzlement. He stated clearly, his voice echoing across the silent room, that the only way Gavin could avoid spending the next 10 years locked inside a federal prison was if he immediately surrendered his remaining 20% founder shares to the new majority owner as basic restitution for the millions in stolen funds. Gavin backed away from the table, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He looked wildly around the room, demanding to know who the new majority owner was. I stood tall at the head of the boardroom table, slowly buttoning the front of my tailored gray blazer. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "You are looking at her." The senior board chairman called for building security. 2 burly guards entered the boardroom within seconds, taking Gavin by the arms and escorting him out of the building. His shouted threats echoed down the hallway until the mahogany doors clicked shut. The investors turned their attention back to me. They did not ask any more questions. They simply opened their portfolios, reviewed the hard data on the screen, and officially recognized my new status as the majority owner of CloudPeak. I spent the rest of the day restructuring the executive team and securing the company assets. It was a decisive victory. But my ex-husband and his family were desperate people, and desperate people rarely surrender without attempting one last foolish maneuver. 2 weeks later, the crisp autumn air in Chicago had grown noticeably colder. I was sitting at my new desk in the penthouse office reviewing a stack of quarterly projections when my lead cybersecurity director knocked on the door. He handed me a glossy, highly stylized digital invitation that had been circulating among the elite venture capital firms in the city. The invitation was for a lavish launch party at a luxury downtown hotel, celebrating the debut of a revolutionary new software application. The startup was called Pinnacle Stream, a name that was painfully unoriginal. The founder and chief executive officer listed on the shiny digital flyer was none other than my sister-in-law, Chelsea. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the invitation with profound irritation. I knew exactly what they were doing. Before Gavin was officially terminated and escorted out of the building, he managed to smuggle an encrypted flash drive out of his old office. He downloaded a raw, uncompiled version of the CloudPeak source code, mistakenly believing he could simply slap a new logo on it and sell it to the highest bidder. Because he was currently facing federal charges and legally barred from corporate technology business, he was using his sister as a proxy. Chelsea was attempting to save her family from total financial ruin by launching a rival tech startup secretly built entirely on the intellectual property I had written with my own two hands. I did not call my lawyers right away. I did not send a standard cease and desist letter through the mail. I wanted to see exactly how far Chelsea was truly willing to take this ridiculous, illegal charade. I decided to attend the launch party in person to watch her crash and burn. The event was held in the grand ballroom of one of the most expensive hotels in downtown Chicago. The family had clearly drained whatever remaining credit they had left to fund this display. When I walked through the main doors later that evening, I saw waiters in crisp white uniforms circulating the room with trays of expensive champagne. Soft electronic music pulsed through the speakers hidden in the ceiling. The ballroom was packed with the most influential angel investors and venture capitalists in the Midwest. These were people looking for the next big tech unicorn, and Chelsea had baited the hook with a stolen masterpiece. I did not check in at the front desk, nor did I announce my presence. I simply blended into the crowd wearing a sleek, understated black evening gown that allowed me to move through the room practically unnoticed. I walked to the very back of the ballroom, standing in the shadows near the heavy velvet curtains, and quietly observed the spectacle unfolding before me. Chelsea was standing near a massive display screen at the front of the room, surrounded by wealthy older men. She wore a stunning white designer suit, holding a crystal glass of champagne. She looked absolutely nothing like the bitter woman who kicked my audit files down a wet driveway just a few weeks ago. Tonight, she played the role of the brilliant female tech pioneer. She laughed loudly at a joke one investor made, tossing her styled hair over her shoulder. She worked the room with the exact same manufactured charisma her brother used to build his fraudulent empire. I watched as Barbara fluttered around the edges of the crowd, wearing a heavy diamond necklace and a smile that looked so tight it might shatter. She was acting as the proud mother of the next great tech visionary, aggressively networking with the wives of the venture capitalists, desperately trying to maintain her slipping grip on high society. Gavin was conspicuously absent, no doubt hiding in a hotel room somewhere pulling the strings, while his sister took all the legal risks on the front lines. At exactly 8 o'clock, the ambient music faded out, and the overhead lights slowly dimmed. A single bright spotlight illuminated the center stage. Chelsea confidently walked up the steps, her white suit gleaming under the lights. She grabbed the microphone from the stand and offered the crowd a radiant, practiced smile. The investors grew quiet, giving her their full attention. Chelsea began her pitch. She spoke with a smooth, rehearsed cadence, telling a fabricated, deeply emotional story about how she had spent the last 3 years developing a revolutionary new software architecture. She claimed that as a woman in a male-dominated industry, she had been forced to work twice as hard to perfect her algorithms. She paced across the stage, using her hands to emphasize her points, stealing the exact same buzzwords Gavin had used in the boardroom. She talked about predictive machine learning, dynamic cloud scaling, and encrypted data processing as if she actually understood what those concepts meant. I stood quietly in the back of the room, taking a slow sip of sparkling water. It was almost physically painful to listen to her butcher the technical descriptions of my work. She was describing the exact code I had written, the complex digital ecosystem I had painstakingly built from nothing. She proudly announced that Pinnacle Stream was going to completely disrupt the current market, offering a faster, more secure, and infinitely more profitable alternative to established companies like CloudPeak. The venture capitalists in the audience were clearly impressed by the presentation. They did not know they were looking at stolen goods. They only saw a polished, confident founder promising them massive returns on their investments. I watched as several of the most prominent investors in the room nodded in agreement, pulling out their expensive smartphones and leather checkbooks, preparing to pledge millions of dollars to fund Chelsea's fraudulent startup. Chelsea concluded her speech with a triumphant raise of her glass, thanking the investors for believing in her vision. The room erupted into enthusiastic applause. Barbara cheered the loudest from the front row, looking absolutely ecstatic as she watched the wealthy men prepare to hand over their money. They genuinely thought they had gotten away with it. They thought they had found a clever loophole to steal my work, bypass my authority, and restore their family to its former glory. I placed my glass of water on a nearby cocktail table. I reached into my small black clutch and pulled out my sleek, lightweight digital tablet. The time for quiet observation was officially over. As the applause began to die down and the investors started walking toward the stage to negotiate their funding pledges, I took a very deep breath and finally stepped out of the shadows to confront her. I moved with deliberate slowness through the sea of tailored suits and expensive perfumes. The grand ballroom was buzzing with the electric energy of sudden wealth. Venture capitalists were pulling out their premium leather checkbooks and tapping eagerly on their mobile banking applications, eager to secure their ground floor equity in what they believed was the next billion-dollar unicorn. I slipped past a group of older men who were loudly congratulating themselves on finding such a brilliant female founder. At the front of the room, Chelsea was basking in the unearned adoration. She leaned over the edge of the stage, shaking hands with a prominent angel investor, her bright white suit catching the glare of the stage lights. She laughed a manufactured, hollow laugh, promising the man his investment would triple. I reached the base of the carpeted stairs leading up to the main stage. My sleek black evening gown brushed quietly against the steps as I ascended, placing me directly in the center of the spotlight. Chelsea turned around to greet the next eager investor, but her practiced smile instantly vanished the second her eyes locked onto mine. Her jaw dropped slightly, and the crystal champagne flute in her hand trembled, sloshing expensive wine over the rim. She quickly tried to recover her composure, plastering on a fake tight smile for the audience watching us. She leaned in close, demanding to know what I was doing here and ordering me to get off her stage. I did not acknowledge her pathetic threats. I simply walked past her, heading straight for the sleek presentation podium where her laptop was connected to the massive ballroom display screens. Chelsea panicked, lunging forward and grabbing my arm, hissing that I was ruining the most important night of her life. I firmly shrugged off her grip, pulling my lightweight digital tablet from my black clutch. I smoothly disconnected the primary display cable from her laptop and plugged it directly into my own device. Chelsea shouted into her microphone, telling the audio-visual technicians to cut the power, but I was already typing. My fingers flew across the digital keyboard of my tablet, executing a complex series of commands I had memorized years ago. I was triggering a deeply embedded security protocol, a digital watermark I had woven into the very foundation of the CloudPeak source code specifically to prevent corporate theft. I hit the final execution key and stepped back from the podium. The massive high-definition screens spanning the entire width of the ballroom wall instantly glitched. The polished blue and white user interface of Pinnacle Stream shattered into a chaotic mess of distorted pixels. A loud, jarring error tone blasted through the ballroom speakers, causing several investors to physically flinch and cover their ears. The screens went completely black for 2 agonizing seconds. Then the display flooded with a blinding shade of crimson red. Huge, bold white letters flashed across the screens. The text read, "Stolen intellectual property, CloudPeak proprietary asset, unauthorized access locked." A collective gasp rippled through the crowded ballroom. The wealthy venture capitalists stopped writing their checks. They lowered their phones, staring up at the flashing red screens in absolute horror. The room plunged into a stunned, suffocating silence. I turned to face the audience, my voice projecting clearly without the need for a microphone. I introduced myself to the room of investors, stating my official title as the majority owner and chief executive officer of CloudPeak. I pointed up to the flashing red screens and informed the crowd that they were not looking at a revolutionary new software application. I explained that they were looking at a raw, uncompiled version of my own proprietary code, which had been illegally downloaded onto an encrypted flash drive and smuggled out of my corporate headquarters by a terminated employee who is currently facing federal fraud charges. Chelsea stared at the screens, her face draining of all color. She dropped her flute. The crystal shattered loudly against the wooden stage floor, sending shards of glass and wine splashing across her pristine white designer suit. She stammered, shaking her head wildly, crying into her microphone that it was a lie, that I had somehow hacked into her system to frame her because I was a bitter, jealous woman trying to destroy her family. I did not engage in a shouting match with a proven thief. I calmly reached back into my clutch and pulled out a legally binding document folded neatly into a heavy envelope. I walked over to where Chelsea was standing, her entire body shaking with terror, and pressed the heavy envelope directly against her chest. She reflexively brought her hands up to take it, officially accepting service. I told her in a voice loud enough for the entire front row to hear that she had just been served with an immediate court-ordered cease and desist mandate. I added that my attorneys had officially filed a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against her for corporate espionage. Barbara shrieked from the front row of the audience. She pushed her way past a group of stunned investors, her face contorted with pure rage. She screamed at me, her voice cracking with hysteria, demanding that I leave her daughter alone and stop trying to ruin their lives. She turned to the wealthy men standing around her, begging them not to listen to my lies, insisting that her family was a respected legacy institution in Chicago and that I was just trying to steal their hard-earned money. The venture capitalists completely ignored Barbara. They were seasoned business professionals who recognized a catastrophic legal liability when they saw one. Several men immediately tore up the checks they had been writing, dropping the torn pieces of paper onto the carpeted floor. Others turned their backs on the stage, dialing their legal teams on their cell phones as they marched toward the ballroom exits. Chelsea realized her fake empire was crumbling in real time. She dropped the lawsuit onto the stage and ran to the edge of the platform, tears streaming down her face, begging the remaining investors to stay. She specifically targeted the two senior partners of the venture capital firm that was hosting the launch event tonight. She pleaded loudly, crying that the software still worked, that she could fix the legal issues, and that they could still make billions if they ignored my lawsuit. The two senior partners stopped walking and looked up at Chelsea with profound disgust. Then they looked over at me. I walked to the edge of the stage, standing right next to a weeping, hyperventilating Chelsea. I looked down at the senior partners and gave them a brief professional nod. I turned my head slightly, offering my sister-in-law a cold smile. I told Chelsea that begging the hosts was a complete waste of time. I explained that she was not just blacklisted from this particular funding round, she was permanently blacklisted from the entire tech industry. Chelsea cried harder, demanding to know how I could possibly control the venture capital firms in this city. I smoothed the skirt of my black gown and told her the truth. I revealed that I had used the massive profits from CloudPeak to aggressively buy out the very venture capital firm hosting her event this morning. I told her she was currently standing in my ballroom drinking my expensive champagne and begging my employees for money. Chelsea stared at me as though I had spoken in a language she could not understand. Then she laughed. It was a brittle, breathless sound, but she clung to it because disbelief was the only defense she had left. She told the audience that I was bluffing, and that no acquisition of a major venture capital firm could happen without weeks of public announcements, regulatory filings, and press coverage. One of the two senior partners reached into his jacket and removed his phone. The screen was filled with urgent messages. He read the first one, then the second, and his expression hardened. His colleague received the same notification a moment later. Both men stepped away from Chelsea and moved toward me. The older partner addressed me formally as chairwoman and apologized that the internal announcement had not reached the event team before the presentation began. He explained to the stunned room that the firm's controlling partnership interests had been acquired through a transaction completed that morning. The closing had remained confidential because several limited partners still needed to receive official notice. My ownership was not a threat, a metaphor, or an emotional claim. It was recorded in executed agreements their own attorneys had approved. The investors nearest the stage began checking their phones. Whispers spread rapidly across the ballroom as corporate databases and internal messages confirmed what I had said. Chelsea's confidence collapsed another inch. She turned on the senior partners and demanded that they honor the commitments they had made to Pinnacle Stream before the acquisition. The younger partner replied that no binding commitment existed. The firm had agreed only to review the demonstration. Even without my ownership, the discovery of stolen intellectual property would have ended the process immediately. Chelsea insisted the software was hers. She claimed the red warning screen was merely a malicious visual effect I had planted to embarrass her. She hurried back to the podium and disconnected my tablet. Then she pulled a second laptop from beneath the lectern, announcing that she had prepared a secure offline backup specifically because she knew I would try to sabotage the event. She connected the backup to the ballroom display system. For one brief second, the polished Pinnacle Stream logo returned. Chelsea smiled in triumph. Then the logo vanished. The same crimson warning filled the wall, followed by a new screen containing a long series of encrypted identifiers, access timestamps, and digital signatures. I explained that the security lock was not tied to a particular laptop or internet connection. It was embedded inside the code itself. Every legitimate Cloud Peak build had to communicate with a licensing key generated by servers under my control. A stolen copy could be moved to a different computer, renamed, compressed, or placed on an offline drive. But the embedded watermark would still identify its origin the moment the software attempted to execute. The ballroom's audio system emitted another tone. This time, the screen displayed the exact date, time, and user credentials connected to the unauthorized download. The account belonged to Gavin. A murmur moved through the crowd. Chelsea shouted that anyone could have stolen her brother's credentials. I opened a second file showing security camera records from Cloud Peak headquarters. The images were time-stamped the night before Gavin lost access to the building. They showed him entering his private office after normal working hours, connecting an external drive to his workstation, and leaving 19 minutes later with a device concealed inside his coat. The cameras had not captured the contents of the drive. They did not need to. The server logs showed precisely which files had been copied during those 19 minutes. Barbara rushed toward the audio-visual control table and ordered the technicians to turn everything off. None of them moved. The senior partner informed her that the ballroom staff now reported to the firm I controlled, and that all event records had been placed under legal preservation. The presentation files, attendee list, security footage, and communications with potential investors would be retained for the pending litigation. Barbara's face twisted with rage. She accused the partners of betrayal and reminded them that her family had introduced them to some of their earliest clients. The older partner replied that professional loyalty did not require participation in fraud. Chelsea seized the microphone again. She told the investors that the disputed code represented only the first version of the product. She promised that with enough funding, she could replace every contested component within 30 days. She said the value of Pinnacle Stream came from her vision, branding, and market strategy, not from the underlying software. An investor in the front row asked her to name the programming language used to build the application. Chelsea paused. Another asked her to explain the system's encryption protocol. She looked toward the control booth. A third asked how many engineers were employed by Pinnacle Stream and where the development team was located. Chelsea claimed those details were confidential. The questions came faster. What was the burn rate? Where were the audited financial statements? Who owned the patents? Which insurance carrier had issued the technology errors policy? Had any cybersecurity firm tested the product? Chelsea's presentation had been built to survive applause, not scrutiny. With every unanswered question, the illusion became more fragile. Then a faint voice emerged from the laptop speakers. Chelsea had forgotten that an encrypted video call was still running in the background. Gavin's face appeared in a small window at the corner of the screen. He was sitting in what looked like a hotel suite, wearing the same wrinkled shirt he had worn after the board meeting. He had apparently been coaching Chelsea through an earpiece during the presentation. He shouted at her to close the program and remove the backup drive. The entire ballroom heard him. Chelsea spun towards the screen in horror. Gavin realized the call had become public and reached toward his camera, but not before he ordered her to destroy the drive and tell the investors that I had hacked the system. The window went black. No one in the room needed another explanation. I told the senior partners that the laptop backup drive and presentation server should be secured without alteration. Their legal counsel, who had been standing near the ballroom entrance, immediately instructed the hotel security team to prevent anyone from removing the equipment. Chelsea grabbed the second laptop and held it against her chest. She said it contained private information and that no one had the right to take it. I reminded her that she had just used the device to solicit millions of dollars from investors while demonstrating stolen corporate property. Preserving it was not optional. Two security officers approached the stage. Chelsea looked toward Barbara for help. Barbara opened her handbag and pulled out a checkbook. In front of the entire room, she offered to reimburse the hosting firm for the event and personally guarantee Pinnacle Stream's first funding round through the family trust. The senior partners declined. Barbara increased the amount. She promised introductions to banks, political donors, and old Chicago families. She spoke more quickly with every offer, trying to purchase the authority she had already lost. The older partner finally closed her checkbook with one hand and told her that the firm's ethics committee would be reviewing every prior transaction connected to her family. Several guests raised their phones to record that exchange. Barbara noticed and fell silent. The security officers took the laptop from Chelsea. She did not resist, but her arms remained suspended in front of her for several seconds, as though she could still feel its weight. The investors who had crowded around the stage now moved away from her. No one wanted to be photographed standing beside the founder of a company publicly identified as stolen. I told Chelsea that the most dangerous part of her plan was not the code theft. It was her belief that confidence could replace competence, and that wealthy people would never ask questions as long as the room looked expensive enough. She had copied Gavin's performance so completely that she had also copied his fatal weakness. Neither of them understood the system they were claiming to have built. Chelsea asked whether I had purchased the venture firm solely to humiliate her. I told her I had purchased it because CloudPeak needed a stable source of capital after Gavin's misconduct damaged investor confidence. Her event had not been the purpose of the acquisition. It had merely revealed why the acquisition was necessary. Then I looked across the ballroom at the torn checks, the locked screens, the preserved computers, and the investors who now understood exactly what they had almost financed. I told Chelsea that there was no remaining version of her story that could survive the evidence. The silence that followed my revelation was absolute and profound. Chelsea crumpled onto the stage, bearing her face in her hands, as the sheer weight of her ruined future finally crushed her. I did not stay to watch the hotel security team escort her and her weeping mother out the service exit. I simply turned around, walked out of my ballroom, and went home to enjoy a peaceful night of sleep. But I knew the war was not entirely over. A family that had survived for generations on arrogance and manipulation does not just surrender quietly. When their financial avenues were completely blocked, they would inevitably turn to the only currency they believed they had left: social capital. By noon the following day, Barbara was already mobilizing her final desperate counterattack. She knew that Gavin was facing imminent federal indictment and that Chelsea was a permanent outcast in the technology sector. Her only remaining move was to try and control the narrative among the Chicago elite, hoping that old money connections could somehow shield them from the coming storm. Desperate to maintain her slipping grip on their social standing, Barbara arranged a highly exclusive emergency luncheon at her prestigious country club in the northern suburbs. For over 3 decades, this opulent, gated institution had served as the impenetrable fortress of her social life. It was a place where wealthy families gathered safely, behind towering wrought iron fences, far removed from the consequences of the real world outside. The main dining room of the club was a masterclass in understated luxury, featuring soaring vaulted ceilings, rich mahogany paneling, and sparkling crystal chandeliers. Waiters in crisp white uniforms poured expensive sparkling water and served delicate salads, moving silently around the tables. Barbara had specifically invited the most powerful and influential matriarchs in the entire city of Chicago. These were women whose husbands sat on the boards of major banks, powerful law firms, and massive corporate conglomerates. If Barbara could successfully convince them that she was the innocent victim of a targeted malicious attack, she could use their combined formidable influence to completely crush me. Barbara sat at the head of a long, pristine white table holding court over her captive audience. She dabbed at her eyes with a monogrammed linen napkin, pitching her voice perfectly so the surrounding tables could overhear her tragic, entirely manufactured tale. She passionately told the wealthy women that I was an unstable, deeply disturbed gold digger who had orchestrated a massive, vindictive scheme to steal her son's brilliant company. She claimed that I had suffered a total psychological breakdown during the divorce proceedings, unable to handle losing access to their immense family wealth. According to Barbara, my intense jealousy over Gavin moving on with his life had driven me to hire criminal hackers to fabricate federal financial documents and plant them in the company's servers. She spun a wildly elaborate theatrical story, insisting that the board of directors at Cloud Peak had been temporarily duped by my forged audits, but that her highly expensive legal team was already in the process of clearing Gavin's good name and restoring him to his rightful position as chief executive officer. She dramatically wiped a fake tear from her cheek, claiming that I had always been intensely envious of their close-knit family dynamic and was now trying to tear them apart out of pure, unadulterated spite. The society women listened with rapt attention, their heavily lotioned faces displaying a mixture of polite shock and profound sympathy. Barbara leaned across the wide table, lowering her voice to a tight conspiratorial whisper meant to convey deep urgency. She warned her influential friends that I was a dangerous, manipulative predator who would stop at nothing to tear down successful legacy families. She pleaded with them to protect their own families and businesses from my supposed wrath. She explicitly asked them to reach out to their powerful husbands and secure a permanent citywide blacklist against me by the end of the day. She wanted to ensure that no respectable corporate firm would ever hire me, no bank would ever approve my loans, and no polite social circle would ever allow me through their doors. The women at the table nodded in vigorous agreement, patting Barbara's shaking hands and promising to make a few discreet phone calls to ensure my professional and social execution. They assured her that they took care of their own kind and that a middle-class accountant like me would never be allowed to disrupt their established, comfortable social order. Barbara finally smiled, her chest heaving with a deep, dramatic sigh of relief. She honestly believed that her high society connections had just saved her family from total ruin. She was completely unaware that I had already walked through the heavy mahogany doors of the grand dining room. I did not sneak into the exclusive country club, nor did I have to argue with the intimidating front desk staff or the security guards to gain entry. I simply walked past the concierge, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floors with unwavering confidence. I wore a tailored dark emerald business suit that projected absolute authority, a sharp, intentional contrast to the soft pastel daytime dresses worn by the wealthy women lunching around me. In my arms, I carried a heavy, substantial stack of pristine, leather-bound financial portfolios. The gold-embossed lettering on the dark covers caught the bright light from the crystal chandeliers above, gleaming with an undeniable sense of importance. I moved through the crowded room with a slow, unhurried grace, refusing to break my stride for anyone. I was not a frantic, jealous ex-wife trying to cause a messy public scene. I was a professional corporate auditor executing a final, highly precise calculation. As I walked deeper into the elegant dining room, the ambient, polite chatter began to slowly die out, spreading outward from me like a ripple in a pond. The gentle clinking of silver forks against fine china ceased completely. The wealthy patrons turned their heads, their eyes tracking my deliberate movement as I navigated the complex maze of elegant tables. The sudden heavy shift in the atmosphere finally caught Barbara's attention. She looked up from her untouched plate, the triumphant, relieved smile instantly freezing on her face. The warm color rapidly drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking hollow-aged and absolutely terrified as she watched me approach her table. The influential women sitting around Barbara fell entirely silent, recognizing me immediately from the vicious stories they had just been fed. They glared at me with blatant disapproval, fully expecting me to start shouting or throwing glassware like the hysterical woman Barbara had described. I did absolutely nothing of the sort. I reached the head table and stopped looking down at the woman who had spent the last hour trying to orchestrate my complete destruction. I did not ask for permission to join their exclusive gathering. I calmly pulled out the velvet-lined chair positioned directly across from my former mother-in-law and took a seat with perfect posture. I placed the stack of heavy leather portfolios squarely in the center of the white tablecloth, right next to a towering vase of fresh pink orchids. Barbara's hands began to shake so violently she had to grip the hard edge of the dining table just to steady herself. She opened her mouth, her voice a shrill, breathless whisper as she demanded to know how I had gotten past the heavy security gates. She frantically told her wealthy friends not to engage with me wildly, signaling a nearby waiter to immediately call the club manager. She hissed across the table that I was trespassing on private property and was about to be arrested and dragged out in handcuffs. I leaned back comfortably in my chair, resting my hands casually on top of the pristine financial portfolios. I looked around the large table, making direct, unflinching eye contact with every single powerful woman seated there. I offered them a polite, strictly professional smile, ignoring Barbara's frantic, desperate panic. I told the women I sincerely apologized for interrupting their afternoon meal, but I had brought some highly sensitive reading material that directly concerned the safety of their personal financial assets. I slid the first leather portfolio across the table directly into the manicured hands of the club president's wife. I exposed Barbara's generational wealth as a carefully constructed Ponzi scheme. I walked them through the documentation showing how Gavin had embezzled from Cloud Peak and secretly drained the investment accounts of several prominent club members to keep his mother draped in diamonds. The reaction was instantaneous and brutal. The polite society masks melted away into genuine fury. The women actively demanded their stolen money back and immediately summoned the club security team to have her physically escorted off the premises in absolute disgrace. As two guards practically dragged a sobbing Barbara away from the table, I took a sip of my sparkling water and casually mentioned that the club board had just approved my new membership application, which meant Barbara and her entire family were now permanently banned from the grounds. That completely severed their social lifeline. But pure narcissism is a dangerous thing, and it drove my ex-husband to make one final spectacular mistake. The Chicago Innovators Gala was held in the Grand Ballroom of a historic downtown hotel on a Friday night, designed to celebrate the best minds in the technology sector. Months ago, long before the forensic audits and the legal battles, Gavin had been scheduled to receive the highly coveted Chief Executive Officer of the Year award. Despite being officially fired, stripped of his assets, and facing an imminent federal indictment, his staggering delusions of grandeur convinced him that he could still salvage his reputation. He believed that if he could just get in front of a room full of 500 elite investors, his natural charisma would win them over. He planned to spin a manipulative narrative, paint himself as a martyr, and secure enough angel investments to launch a brand new venture. Gavin crashed the event with Barbara and Chelsea trailing behind him like loyal disciples. The organizers had tried to stop him at the door, but he forced his way past the registration desk, using his sheer size and aggressive entitlement to push through the crowd. I was already backstage, having been quietly invited by the gala committee to officially accept the award on behalf of the restructured Cloud Peak. I stood in the heavy shadows of the stage wings, watching as Gavin marched straight up the carpeted steps and aggressively grabbed the microphone from the startled master of ceremonies. He stood at the podium, looking out over the sea of tuxedos and evening gowns. He launched into a tearful, highly rehearsed speech about overcoming vicious personal attacks. He spoke with a manufactured tremble in his voice, claiming that true innovation is always met with resistance by small-minded people. He painted himself as a resilient hero, rising above the ashes of a toxic marriage to a vindictive, jealous ex-wife. He promised the audience that his next venture would change the world, and he invited anyone with vision and capital to join him on his journey. I did not yell. I did not storm the stage or try to wrestle the microphone from his grip. I stepped out from the dark wings of the stage and walked slowly into the harsh glare of the spotlight. Gavin saw me approaching, and his fake, tearful expression hardened into a look of pure panic. I did not even look at him. I simply raised my right hand and gave a sharp, deliberate signal to the audiovisual technician sitting in the control booth at the back of the ballroom. The massive high-definition screens spanning the wall directly behind Gavin were originally intended to display a polished video montage of his career highlights. Instead, the screens flickered and instantly switched inputs. Suddenly, the complete, unedited forensic audit of his life was projected in glowing 10-foot-tall letters for the entire room to read. The display cycled through a devastating slideshow of undeniable criminal evidence. The 500 elite investors stared up at images of frozen bank accounts, forged corporate invoices, and high-definition receipts of the luxury items Gavin had purchased using stolen employee pension funds. There was a receipt for a massive diamond tennis bracelet flashing right next to a document showing a deduction from the company healthcare budget. There was a ledger detailing the offshore accounts Barbara had used to fund her country club lifestyle, juxtaposed against the depleted retirement savings of the very people sitting in the audience. The meticulous color-coded spreadsheets I had spent the last year secretly compiling were now on full public display, laying bare the absolute depth of his depravity and greed. The silence in the grand ballroom lasted for only 3 seconds before the entire space erupted into pure outrage. The polite decorum of the black tie event vanished completely. The room filled with the sound of 500 wealthy investors shouting in anger and disbelief. These were men and women who had trusted Gavin with their capital and who now realized they had been completely defrauded. The anger was palpable, a heavy, suffocating wave of collective fury directed entirely at the man standing frozen at the podium. Gavin dropped the microphone. It hit the wooden stage with a loud, piercing screech of feedback, but the sound was barely audible over the roaring crowd. He turned around, his eyes wide and terrified, as he finally looked up at the massive screens behind him. He saw his own financial crimes broadcast in indisputable detail. He stumbled backward, his hands grasping for the edge of the podium to keep himself from collapsing. The major sponsors of the gala, the billionaire venture capitalists who had previously funded CloudPeak, did not just sit down. They actively stood up, their faces flushed with rage, and marched directly up to the edge of the stage. They pointed their fingers at Gavin, shouting over the noise of the crowd, demanding their investments back immediately. One angel investor slammed his fist against the edge of the stage, screaming that he was going to personally ensure Gavin spent the rest of his natural life rotting inside a federal penitentiary. Barbara and Chelsea had been standing near the front row, ready to cheer for Gavin's triumphant comeback. Now they were frantically trying to push their way backward through the angry mob, desperate to distance themselves from the catastrophic fallout. The investors around them recognized them from the offshore account ledgers displayed on the screens. People began shouting at Barbara, demanding to know how she could steal from her own friends to fund her pathetic social climbing. The hostility was overwhelming, trapping them in a sea of angry, betrayed elites. I stood completely still on the stage, watching the destruction of Gavin's fraudulent empire play out exactly as I had calculated. The man who had spent years making me feel small, who had locked me in a home office while he took credit for my brilliance, was now trembling under the furious gaze of the very people he had sought to impress. He was completely exposed, stripped of his stolen wealth and his manufactured charm. His desperate eyes darted around the hostile room, searching for a single sympathetic face, and finding absolutely nothing but pure, unadulterated contempt from the audience. There were no more lies he could tell, no more shell companies he could hide behind, and no more golden parachutes to save him from the consequences of his actions. He was ruined, and he knew it. Amber was standing in the front row of the audience, bathed in the harsh red glow radiating from the massive digital screens. She stared up at the high-definition receipts detailing the offshore accounts and the corporate slush funds. Her eyes locked onto a specific ledger line that bore her own name, connecting her directly to the felony embezzlement and the federal tax fraud. The absolute terror of the situation finally pierced through her thick layer of denial. She realized with sudden, brutal clarity that Gavin was not just going down in flames, he was taking her down right alongside him. The luxurious life in Miami they had been planning all week was completely gone, replaced by the very real, immediate threat of a lengthy federal prison sentence. Amber did not hesitate to save her own skin. She hiked up the skirt of her expensive designer evening gown and practically sprinted up the carpeted stairs leading to the main stage. Gavin turned toward her as she approached his side. For a brief, pathetic moment, his panicked face softened. He actually believed she was coming up to the podium to stand by his side, to offer him loving support in front of the angry mob of elite investors. He reached his trembling hand out toward her, a desperate, silent plea for comfort. Amber slapped his hand away with such incredible force that the sharp smack echoed over the shouting crowd. She did not look at him with love, loyalty, or even basic pity. She looked at him like he was a highly contagious disease. Amber bent down and snatched the microphone right off the wooden floor where Gavin had dropped it. She gripped the metal cylinder tightly in both hands, turned her back entirely on the man she had been sleeping with for 3 years, and faced the furious audience of venture capitalists. Amber screamed into the microphone, her voice shrill and echoing loudly across the massive vaulted ballroom. She completely threw Gavin to the wolves, frantically trying to distance herself from his extensive financial crimes. She cried out to the investors that she was completely innocent, claiming that Gavin had violently manipulated her from the very beginning of their relationship. She yelled that he was a compulsive liar who had tightly controlled all of the bank accounts and forced her to accept the stolen diamond jewelry against her will. She painted herself as a naive, helpless victim of a powerful, abusive chief executive officer, explicitly detailing how he had constantly bragged to her about siphoning the employee pension funds to fund his lavish lifestyle. In her desperate, frantic attempt to avoid jail time, she was effectively delivering a full public confession of his guilt directly into a live microphone. Gavin tried to lunge forward to grab the microphone back, shouting that she was a liar and a gold digger. But the catastrophic damage was already done. Every single influential investor in the room had just heard his own mistress corroborate the exact forensic audit I had projected onto the screens. The shouting in the ballroom reached a deafening, chaotic crescendo as the crowd realized the absolute depth of his deception. But the anger and the noise in the room were suddenly cut short by a dramatic shift in the atmosphere. The heavy floor-to-ceiling windows lining the eastern wall of the historic hotel ballroom suddenly began to flash with a rhythmic, pulsing light. Brilliant strokes of red and blue light cut fiercely through the darkness outside, illuminating the large glass panes and reflecting wildly off the crystal chandeliers hanging above our heads. The flashing police lights painted the shocked faces of the wealthy investors in harsh, alternating colors. The heavy sound of vehicle doors slamming shut echoed from the street below. A sudden tense hush fell over the entire crowd. Everyone stopped shouting, turned their attention away from the stage, and looked toward the back of the grand ballroom. The massive double oak doors that served as the main entrance were suddenly shoved open with incredible commanding force. A dozen federal agents marched through the entrance in perfect, synchronized formation. They wore dark, tactical jackets with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service printed boldly across their broad backs. They moved with absolute authority, their faces stern, serious, and uncompromising. The sea of wealthy investors, billionaires, and corporate sponsors immediately parted for them, stepping back and clearing a wide, unobstructed path straight down the center aisle of the ballroom. The lead agent, a tall man with a severe expression and a utility belt clipped to his waist, kept his eyes locked dead on the stage. Gavin froze completely. The remaining blood drained from his face as he watched the federal agents march aggressively up the carpeted steps. He took a stumbling step backward, hitting his shoulders hard against the digital projection screen that was still proudly displaying his extensive financial crimes. The lead agent stepped onto the stage and approached him, reaching into his dark tactical jacket to pull out a thick stack of folded legal documents. He held up a federal arrest warrant, his voice booming clearly across the silent room, without the need for any electronic amplification. He formally announced that Gavin was being placed under immediate arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and severe federal tax evasion. 2 agents moved in quickly, grabbing Gavin firmly by the arms. They spun him around aggressively, forcing his hands tightly behind his back. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting securely around his wrists echoed sharply through the quiet room. Gavin did not try to physically fight them. He was physically trembling, his knees buckling slightly as the agents read him his Miranda rights in a flat, clinical tone. He was being stripped of his freedom, his dignity, and his power right in front of the 500 elite people he had just tried to manipulate. The ultimate humiliation was finally complete. As the federal agents began to physically march him toward the edge of the stage, absolute panic finally broke through Gavin's initial state of shock. He began to thrash against their grip, dragging his expensive leather shoes against the floor. His eyes darted frantically across the sea of faces in the audience. He was desperately searching the crowd for a lifeline, looking for any possible way out of the nightmare he had created for himself. His desperate gaze finally landed on a woman standing near the side exit of the ballroom. It was Barbara. She was clutching her expensive designer handbag tightly against her chest, trying to quietly inch her way toward the service doors, to escape the humiliating spectacle without being noticed. Gavin dug his heels into the carpet, fighting the federal agents just long enough to shout across the ballroom. He screamed his mother's name, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated terror. He begged Barbara to call her highly expensive corporate lawyers immediately. He pleaded with her to use the secret offshore retirement account, the hidden cache of money she had kept entirely concealed from her country club friends and the government to post his bail. He cried out that he could not survive in a federal holding cell and begged her to save him loudly, invoking their sacred family bond and her maternal loyalty in front of the entire silent crowd. Barbara froze halfway to the exit door. She slowly turned her head, looking up at her golden child standing on the stage in steel handcuffs. She then looked at the dozen federal agents who had all stopped moving. Every single agent, along with every wealthy investor in the room, was now staring directly at her because her son had just explicitly shouted about a secret illegal offshore bank account in front of the Internal Revenue Service. Barbara's face went completely blank. She looked back at Gavin, her eyes completely devoid of any warmth, pity, or maternal affection. She saw that her son was no longer a valuable asset. He was a massive, dangerous liability who was actively dragging her into a federal criminal investigation. Instead of rushing to his side, instead of offering him words of comfort or promising to secure his legal defense, Barbara made her final defining choice. She pulled her expensive designer coat tightly around her shoulders, completely turned her back on her weeping son, and attempted to quickly slink away into the angry crowd to save her own skin. She left her absolute favorite child to be hauled off to a federal penitentiary without a single backward glance, proving once and for all that their supposedly unbreakable family loyalty was nothing more than a shallow, deeply toxic illusion. For one suspended moment, Gavin seemed unable to understand what his mother had done. He stopped struggling against the agents and stared toward the side exit where Barbara had turned away from him. The expression on his face was not remorse. It was disbelief that the loyalty he had demanded from everyone else had finally failed him. He shouted her name again. Barbara did not answer. The lead agent ordered Gavin to keep moving. As they guided him toward the stairs, he twisted around and searched for another person to save him. His eyes found Amber, who was still standing near the fallen microphone. He called her sweetheart and promised that the situation was temporary. He told her his attorneys would clear everything up if she refused to speak to investigators. Amber looked at the agents, then at the enormous ledger bearing her name on the screen. The bracelet on her wrist seemed to weigh more with every second. She unclasped it with trembling fingers and placed it carefully on the podium. Then she reached into her evening bag, removed her phone, and handed it to the nearest investigator. She told him there were messages Gavin had instructed her to delete. Gavin's face changed instantly. He called her a liar and tried to pull free. The agents tightened their grip. Amber began speaking faster, explaining that Gavin had used encrypted messaging applications and had sent her photographs of account balances whenever he transferred money. She admitted that he had told her the funds came from special executive reserves. She also admitted that he had coached her to describe the jewelry as gifts purchased years earlier if anyone asked questions. The lead investigator instructed another agent to escort Amber to a private room for a formal interview. He warned her not to erase, alter, or remotely access any device connected to the case. Amber nodded repeatedly. She did not look at Gavin again as she left the stage. Chelsea reacted differently. She slipped her own phone behind her back and began tapping the screen with both thumbs. A federal agent noticed the movement and ordered her to stop. Chelsea claimed she was contacting an attorney, but the agent could see a progress bar indicating that she was deleting a cloud archive. He took the phone from her hand and placed it inside an evidence bag. Chelsea screamed that he had no right to seize her property. The agent informed her that the device appeared to contain communications related to an active conspiracy, and that any attempt to destroy evidence after receiving a preservation order could become a separate offense. Her anger vanished. She looked toward Barbara, but her mother was already moving farther into the crowd. The master of ceremonies remained frozen beside the curtains. He had spent months preparing a celebration of Gavin's supposed achievements, and now every image on the stage had become evidence in a criminal investigation. He approached the microphone stand cautiously and asked the lead agent whether the gala needed to be evacuated. The agent said guests were free to leave after providing contact information, but the stage control booth and event servers would remain secured. Hotel staff began directing attendees toward registration tables where investigators collected names and business cards. The 500 people who had arrived expecting champagne and speeches now formed quiet lines to become potential witnesses. The senior board chairman came to stand beside me. His earlier anger had settled into exhaustion. He told me the company's crisis team had already contacted the employees whose retirement and health accounts had been affected. Cloud Peak's insurance carrier had agreed to advance emergency funds while the recovered assets moved through the forfeiture process. No employee would lose medical coverage because of Gavin's theft. That was the first piece of news all evening that felt like a victory. I asked about the canceled bonuses and the 12 entry-level positions Gavin had sacrificed to hide his spending. The chairman said the board would restore the bonus pool and reopen the positions during the next quarter, provided the restructuring plan stabilized cash flow. He also said several investors had offered bridge financing after reviewing the independent audit. I looked around at the angry people in the ballroom. Their support was not forgiveness, and it was not charity. It was a calculated decision based on evidence. For the first time in years, that was enough for me. A local television reporter had managed to enter through the lobby before federal agents secured the doors. She approached with a camera operator and asked whether I had orchestrated Gavin's public arrest as revenge for the divorce. The question was designed for spectacle. I told her the investigation had been conducted by federal authorities, the company's audit committee, and independent professionals. My marriage explained how Gavin had gained access to my trust. It did not change what he had done with company money. I declined to discuss evidence beyond the official filings and asked her to speak with the investigators. She tried again, asking how it felt to watch my former husband lose everything. I said the important question was how the employees felt, knowing their health benefits and retirement savings would be restored. Then I walked away before she could turn the answer into another family drama. Near the edge of the stage, Gavin was still delaying the agents. He had abandoned the arrogant posture he carried into the gala. His shoulders sagged beneath his formal jacket, and his voice had dropped into a desperate whisper. When I passed him, he called my name. I stopped several feet away. He told me I could end the nightmare with one phone call. He said the board respected me now, and that federal investigators would listen if I described the transfers as authorized executive expenses. He claimed we had both made mistakes during the marriage and asked me to remember the company we had built together. I reminded him that when we built Cloud Peak, he took public credit for my work. When the company struggled, he asked me to surrender my salary while he financed another life. When I discovered the theft, he threatened to destroy my career. He was not asking me to save the company. He was asking me to lie so he could escape the consequences. Gavin lowered his voice even further. He promised to give me the house, the shares, and every remaining asset if I changed my testimony. I told him none of those things were his to give anymore. The lead agent moved between us and instructed Gavin to continue walking. Gavin's composure finally broke. He shouted that Cloud Peak would collapse without him, that the investors would eventually turn against me, and that I would regret refusing his final offer. His voice echoed through the ballroom, but few people looked up. They were busy giving statements, contacting attorneys, and calculating the damage he had caused. The audience he had spent his life pursuing had already moved on. The agents escorted him down the carpeted stairs. At the bottom, the gala committee chair approached the master of ceremonies and quietly handed him a revised announcement. The master of ceremonies returned to the microphone and stated that the Chief Executive Officer of the Year award had been formally withdrawn. The organization would instead recognize the Cloud Peak audit compliance and engineering teams for protecting the company and its employees during the crisis. A restrained round of applause began near the back of the room. It spread gradually, not with the excitement of a glamorous award ceremony, but with the sober recognition of work that had gone unseen for too long. I did not walk forward to accept anything. The people who deserved that moment were the employees who had questioned false invoices, preserved records, and refused to participate in the fraud. As Gavin reached the ballroom doors, he turned his head one last time. He looked first at me, then at Amber's abandoned bracelet on the podium, and finally toward the space where his mother had been standing. There was no one left beside him. Across the room, Barbara made her own decision. She lowered her head, pulled her coat around her shoulders, and began slipping between the departing guests before the investigators could ask her any more questions. I watched Barbara disappear into the frantic crowd of fleeing investors, her expensive designer coat pulled tight around her trembling shoulders. The grand ballroom was in a state of absolute pandemonium. Federal agents were actively cordoning off the main stage, directing a pale and terrified Gavin toward the service elevators to avoid the massive swarm of local media that had likely already gathered at the front entrance of the hotel. I did not feel any lingering need to stay and watch my former husband be shoved into the back of a government transport vehicle. The meticulously planned execution of my forensic audit had achieved its exact purpose, and the suffocating heated air of the crowded ballroom was beginning to give me a slight headache. I turned my back on the flashing red and blue lights reflecting violently against the walls and walked quietly out through the side doors. The thick carpet muffled my footsteps as I navigated the long, empty corridors of the historic building, making my way down toward the main lobby. The sharp contrast between the chaotic, emotionally charged atmosphere of the gala and the quiet serenity of the lobby was jarring. I retrieved my coat from the front desk, attendant offered a polite smile of thanks, and stepped out through the heavy revolving glass doors into the freezing Chicago night. The severe autumn storm that had been threatening the city all evening had finally broken. A torrential downpour was aggressively hammering the dark pavement, sending thick rivers of cold water rushing into the street gutters. The valet stand was completely overwhelmed with panicked guests, trying to desperately flee the ruined event. But I stood patiently under the wide canvas awning, pulling my coat tight against the biting wind. I handed my ticket to a rushing attendant and waited, feeling a profound sense of physical and mental exhaustion slowly washing over my body. The intense adrenaline that had sustained me through the boardroom takeover, the software lockout, and the final gala presentation was slowly beginning to fade away. I just wanted to go back to my quiet apartment, pour myself a glass of water, and finally get a full night of peaceful sleep. As I stood watching the heavy rain bounce off the hoods of the lined-up luxury cars, a sudden frantic movement in my peripheral vision caught my immediate attention. A figure was stumbling wildly through the relentless downpour, pushing aggressively past a group of angry venture capitalists who were waiting for their own vehicles. It was Barbara. She looked absolutely nothing like the formidable, terrifying matriarch who had ruled over her high society country club just a few short hours ago. Her incredibly expensive custom-tailored evening gown was completely soaked, the heavy silk fabric dragging heavily through the muddy puddles on the concrete. The elegant, immaculate hairstyle she had spent hours perfecting at the salon had collapsed into a stringy, wet mess, plastered flat against her pale face. Her makeup, usually applied with the strict precision of a professional artist, was running down her cheeks in dark, jagged streaks. She looked completely wild, stripped of every single ounce of her manufactured dignity and social armor. She was shivering violently in the freezing wind, her eyes darting around the crowded valet area until they finally locked onto me, standing calmly under the dry awning. Barbara did not simply walk toward me in the rain. She practically lunged forward through the crowded drop-off zone, her expensive heels slipping dangerously on the slick, wet pavement. She aggressively pushed her way under the protective canvas awning, gasping for air, bringing the sharp scent of damp wool and sheer panic directly into my personal space. I did not step back, nor did I even flinch. I stood my ground, firmly looking at her with a blank, entirely unreadable expression. Barbara opened her mouth instinctively, trying to summon the harsh, commanding tone she had used to belittle me for the last 5 years. She quickly raised her hand, her finger trembling as she pointed it at my chest, but the cruel words completely failed her. She looked back toward the hotel doors, knowing that her favorite child was currently being processed by federal authorities inside the building. She knew that her wealthy country club friends had permanently blacklisted her from their social circles, and she knew that the bank accounts she relied on to survive were officially frozen by the federal government. The crushing, undeniable weight of her new, impoverished reality finally snapped the last remaining thread of her pride. Right there in front of the highly busy valet attendants and the wealthy gala guests, Barbara's knees buckled. She collapsed straight down onto the wet, freezing concrete right at my feet. The sudden impact of her knees hitting the hard pavement splashed cold, dirty water onto the hem of my black evening gown, but I did not bother to brush it off. Barbara reached out with both hands, her fingers desperately grabbing onto the wet fabric of my coat. She tilted her head back, looking up at me with a face entirely contorted by raw fear and total desperation. She began to sob, letting out loud, jagged cries that echoed over the steady sound of the falling rain. She begged me to help her. She cried out that she had absolutely nowhere to go, pleading with me to understand that her entire world had just been ripped away in a matter of hours. She sobbed that the federal agents were probably already searching her private residence, and that she could not even afford to rent a cheap motel room for the night. She looked up into my eyes, her voice dropping into a pathetic, whimpering plea. She actually attempted to play the one specific card she had spent years actively destroying. Barbara tightened her grip on my coat, her knuckles turning white from the physical strain. She cried that we were still family. She begged me to remember the holidays we had spent together, completely ignoring the fact that she had used every single one of those holidays to intentionally humiliate me in front of her wealthy friends. She pleaded with me to find some compassion in my heart, insisting that she was just an older woman who had been blindly manipulated by her own son. She sobbed that she did not know the true extent of Gavin's financial crimes, weaving a desperate, transparent lie to save herself from the severe consequences of her own boundless greed. She begged me for a small monthly allowance, claiming she just needed enough cash to keep her out of the city homeless shelters. When I did not immediately respond to that pathetic request, her panic escalated to a new level. She begged me for a place to sleep. She reminded me that I now held the legal deed to the sprawling family estate, the very house she had tried to aggressively evict me from in the pouring rain just a few weeks ago. She cried that there were 8 empty bedrooms in that massive mansion. She pleaded with me to just let her live in one of the small guest rooms, promising that she would stay completely out of my way, that she would never bother me, and that she would be eternally grateful for my mercy. She knelt on the wet concrete, a broken, penniless woman, begging the daughter-in-law she had always despised for the basic human necessities of shelter and survival. I looked down at Barbara's hands gripping my coat. A few weeks earlier, those same hands had pointed toward the street while she ordered me to leave the house I had helped finance. Now she was asking me to erase the consequences of choices she had made for years. I gently removed her fingers from the fabric. I told her she would not be returning to the estate. The property was no longer a family refuge, and I would not allow it to become another stage where she could rebuild control over me. The house was being prepared for sale. After the secured debt and legal costs were resolved, I intended to direct the remaining proceeds toward the Employee Restitution Fund, Cloud Peak had established for the benefits and bonuses Gavin had stolen. Barbara stared at me as if the answer were an act of cruelty. She said the estate contained family history heirlooms and memories that belonged to her. I reminded her that she had treated the property as Gavin's private reward while using borrowed money to maintain it. Sentiment did not erase Lean's fraudulent transfers or unpaid obligations. Her face hardened for a moment. The old Barbara resurfaced beneath the rain and ruined makeup. She accused me of stealing the family legacy and said I would never belong in their world no matter how many companies or houses I acquired. I let her finish. Then I told her I had no desire to belong in a world that required someone else to remain powerless. I was not going to punish her, but I was also not going to become her new source of money, housing, or social protection. Compassion did not require surrendering the boundaries that had taken me years to build. Barbara's anger collapsed as quickly as it appeared. She lowered her head and whispered that she truly had nowhere to sleep. I took out my phone and called Harrison. During the investigation, his firm had arranged a court-approved support service for defendants and witnesses whose assets were under restraint. The program did not provide luxury private staff or unlimited credit. It provided temporary lodging, transportation to legal appointments, and access to a financial case manager. I asked him to reserve a room for Barbara for 3 nights at a modest extended-stay hotel while her attorneys determined which personal funds were lawfully available to her. Barbara heard every word. She looked up sharply when I mentioned the hotel. She asked whether I expected her to live in a place with ordinary travelers and shared laundry machines. I said she was free to decline. The silence between us lasted several seconds. Finally, she whispered that she would accept. I sent the address to her phone and told her a driver connected to the legal service would collect her from the hotel entrance in 15 minutes. I also warned her that the assistance was not a private allowance from me. It was temporary, documented, and conditioned on her cooperation with the court. She would be required to disclose assets, surrender financial records, and stop contacting potential witnesses in an attempt to shape their statements. Barbara flinched at the last condition. That reaction told me she had already been thinking about doing exactly that. I stepped around her as my car arrived beneath the awning. She remained on the wet pavement, but she was no longer clinging to me. A hotel employee brought her a blanket and helped her to a bench near the entrance. For once, the next decision belonged entirely to her. I entered the back seat and closed the door. Through the rain-streaked window, I watched Barbara read the message containing the hotel address. Her shoulders slumped, but she did not throw the phone away. She had spent her entire life treating ordinary existence as humiliation. Now, ordinary existence was the only safe ground left beneath her. The car pulled away. The legal consequences unfolded slowly after that night. There was no single dramatic morning when every case ended and every stolen dollar returned. Investigators spent months reconstructing transfers, interviewing employees, and tracing assets through shell companies. The process was tedious, procedural, and far less glamorous than the public arrest. It was also far more permanent. Gavin initially pleaded not guilty to every charge. He gave his attorneys contradictory explanations, blaming accountants, vendors, Amber, and eventually his own mother. But the digital records were too complete. The false invoices carried his approval credentials. His messages described how funds should be disguised. Amber's phone contained photographs of account balances and instructions for moving jewelry before auditors arrived. Chelsea's seized laptop connected the stolen source code directly to his Cloud Peak account. Faced with the evidence and the possibility of additional obstruction charges, Gavin eventually entered a plea agreement. He surrendered his remaining interests in the company, forfeited the assets linked to the fraud, and accepted a federal prison sentence. The court also ordered restitution, though everyone understood that complete repayment would take years. Amber cooperated early. She returned the bracelet the vehicle Gavin had placed in her name, and several other luxury items purchased through the slush fund. Her cooperation reduced her exposure, but it did not preserve the life she had imagined. The Miami Mansion yacht and rival company had existed only as promises financed by stolen money. Once the accounts were frozen, the relationship she had described as true love dissolved into witness interviews and competing legal strategies. Chelsea settled the corporate espionage lawsuit after forensic specialists confirmed that she had knowingly presented CloudPeak code as her own. She signed a public admission, surrendered the Pinnacle Stream name and assets, and accepted a long-term prohibition against serving as an officer of any company financed by the venture firm. The public statement was only a few paragraphs, but it destroyed the identity she had tried to manufacture on that hotel stage. Barbara's situation was quieter. She was not immediately charged with the same offenses as Gavin, but the financial investigation dismantled the fiction surrounding her wealth. The country club terminated her membership. Creditors seized the jewelry and accounts connected to misappropriated funds. The family trust, once described as limitless, proved to be heavily leveraged and partially sustained by money Gavin had diverted. She moved into a small furnished apartment arranged through her legal case manager. For several months, she sent me messages that alternated between apologies, accusations, and requests for help. I did not answer the emotional ones. When her attorneys needed documents related to the estate, I directed them to Harrison. When she attempted to contact CloudPeak investors, the court reminded her of the conditions attached to her release. Eventually, the messages stopped. I never moved back into the stone mansion. Walking through its empty rooms after the sale was approved, I realized the house had never represented safety. It had represented labor no one acknowledged, and status I had never valued. I kept a few personal books and photographs. Everything else was inventoried, sold, or returned to its lawful owner. The sale funded a substantial portion of the employee restitution program. CloudPeak restored the medical reserve, paid the delayed bonuses, and reopened the graduate positions Gavin had canceled. We also created an independent compliance office that reported directly to the audit committee, not to the chief executive. No future employee would have to choose between protecting the company and protecting a powerful executive. I accepted the role of chief executive officer only after the board agreed to those safeguards. I did not want another personality cult with a different person at the center. We published clearer financial reports, separated technical ownership from executive branding, and established an employee equity pool. The people who had actually built the company finally received a measurable share of what their work created. 6 months after the gala, I stood in the same CloudPeak lobby where I had once entered through a side door. The building looked unchanged, but the feeling was entirely different. Employees greeted me by name, not because they feared me, but because they knew I would listen when the numbers and the promises did not match. That evening, I drove home to a smaller house overlooking a quiet stretch of the lake. There were no gates, no marble staircase, and no rooms maintained solely to impress guests. There was a desk beside a wide window, a kitchen I actually used, and enough silence to hear myself think. For the first time, silence did not feel like invisibility. It felt like peace. Only after the lawsuits, audits, and public spectacle faded did I understand what the entire year had truly changed. Looking back on the absolute chaos of the past year, the greatest lesson I learned is that true power does not come from screaming the loudest or throwing the biggest tantrums. True power comes from knowing your own worth and refusing to let anyone else dictate your value. For 5 long years, I allowed my ex-husband and his incredibly toxic family to lock me in the shadows. I let them convince me that my hard work was just background noise to his supposed genius. They took my loyalty for granted, assuming I would simply accept their disrespect because we were bound by marriage. But loyalty should never be a one-way street, and it certainly should not be used as a weapon to drain your spirit or your bank account. When they finally showed their true colors on that wet driveway, they thought they had successfully broken me. They thought stripping away my possessions would strip away my identity. Instead, it only stripped away the heavy illusion I had been carrying. I learned that you cannot reason with people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You cannot earn the respect of individuals who build their entire social standing on the exploitation of others. You can only gather your facts, secure your boundaries, and walk away with your head held high. Sometimes the most devastating revenge is simply stepping into the light and letting the truth speak for itself. You do not have to sink to their level to win. You just have to realize that you are the architect of your own life. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family or a relationship that diminished your worth? Share your story in the comments below, and please subscribe for more stories of resilience and finding your true power.